What's up, ladies and gentlemen? Omni-sensei here with What If I Were Reborn in Smallville as Clark Kent? The Future Superman. Part 3. If you enjoy this type of content, please super smash that like button. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Don't forget to check out the original story linked in the description. Let's dive into the rise of Superman without further ado. Clark drove towards the school, the sound of the engine filling the silence in the car. Chloe sat beside him, looking out the window, lost in her thoughts. The atmosphere between them was calm, but there was a sense of something unresolved in the air. Vroom. If anyone asks, you can say it was you who broke up with me, Clark said, breaking the silence, his voice gentle but firm. There's no need, Clark. I don't owe anyone an explanation. But if you really want to avoid problems for me, keep it a secret until the end of the break, Chloe replied, turning away from the window to meet Clark's eyes for a moment. Clark nodded, a light, melancholic smile on his face. He understood Chloe's request. He knew she was trying to avoid complications and rumors at school, and he would respect her wishes. Jor-El, are you there? Yes, Kal-El. I am here. If the weather continues as it is, there'll soon be a tornado storm. I need the best way to stop it. Of course, I also have to worry about the consequences. Interfering with the weather is risky, Kal-El. You could alter the course of the tornado by using your super speed to create a countercurrent, but you must consider the repercussions. Forcing nature to change its course can have unforeseen effects. Clark ran a hand over his face, pondering the information. I can't just let people be in danger. If there's a way to minimize the damage and prevent anyone from getting hurt, I have to try. If you decide to intervene, do so with caution. Try to disperse the tornado in an open field, away from populated areas. This will reduce the risk of destruction and harm to others. Can Arctic breath on the tornado end it? Yes, Kal-El. Your freezing breath can weaken the tornado by lowering the temperature of the warm air that fuels it. However, this also requires precision. You'll need to act quickly to avoid causing other weather problems. Clark took a deep breath, reflecting on the best way to handle the situation. He knew that intervening in nature's course was a dangerous decision, but he couldn't just stand by. Destroying Smallville wouldn't benefit anyone. Clark stepped down from the loft and looked at the darkening sky. I just want to protect everyone, Jor-El. I don't want to be the cause of the world's end. I trust you, Kal-El. Just remember to act wisely and not to underestimate the power of nature. Clark noticed a car approaching the farm. He frowned, trying to identify the vehicle in the distance. Who would it be at this hour, he thought. The car stopped near the farm's entrance, and Clark activated his X-ray vision. He recognized Roger Nixon, a reporter he'd seen with Lex a few times. Roger seemed to be observing the house intently, as if searching for something. Jor-El, it looks like we have an unwanted guest. Precaution is necessary, Kal-El. I suggest you find out what he wants without arousing suspicion. Clark took a deep breath, making a decision. He moved quickly, using his super speed to approach Roger's car without being seen. Within seconds, he was behind the vehicle, listening to Roger murmur to himself. Lex must be right. Something strange is happening here, and I'm going to find out what it is, Roger said, adjusting the camera he carried. Clark turned intangible, phasing through the door of Roger's car without making a sound. He entered the vehicle and approached the reporter, touching his head gently. You found nothing relevant here, Roger. Never look for the Kents again, Clark murmured as he precisely manipulated Roger's memories. Roger blinked a few times, his eyes becoming glassy for a moment. Then he relaxed, as if the entire purpose of his investigation had been erased from his mind. Clark watched as Roger turned off the camera, a confused look on his face. What am I doing here? Must have been a mistake, Roger said to himself, starting the car and preparing to leave. Vroom. Clark exited the car, still intangible, and quickly moved away. He watched from a distance as Roger turned around and left the farm, with no intention of returning. Clark let out a sigh of relief. Problem solved, Jor-El. Well done, Kal-El. Just remember, some problems are best resolved without conflict. Whitney entered the Talon, his eyes downcast and his expression desolate. He looked distant, as if carrying an unbearable weight. Lana, who was behind the counter serving customers, immediately noticed Whitney's state and approached him, concerned. "Whitney, are you all right? You look..." Lana paused, trying to find the right words. "You look sad." "Lana, my dad passed away." His voice was choked, laden with emotion. Lana's eyes widened, feeling her heart tighten. "Oh, Whitney. I'm so sorry." She quickly came around the counter and hugged him, holding him close. Whitney returned the embrace, his body trembling slightly as tears began to roll down his face. "I don't know what to do now, Lana." "He was everything to me," Whitney murmured, his voice barely a whisper. Lana held him tightly, gently rubbing his back. "You'll get through this, Whitney. I'm here for you. We're all here for you." She looked at him, her eyes filled with compassion. "You're not alone." Whitney nodded slowly, closing his eyes as he let Lana comfort him. "Thank you, Lana. I really need you right now." "I know," Lana replied, her voice soft and full of care. "We'll get through this together." Chloe sat on her bed, her eyes swollen and her expression weary. She held the phone in her hands, wondering whether or not to make the call. After a long sigh, she decided to dial the number she knew by heart. The phone rang a few times before a familiar voice answered on the other end. "Hey, cuz. What's going on? Are you okay?" Lois asked, the concern in her tone evident. "Lois. Chloe tried to respond, but her voice faltered, and the tears began to fall again. She swallowed hard, trying to compose herself. "Clark and I broke up." "What? What do you mean, broke up?" Lois sounded incredulous. "Chloe, tell me I don't have to go down there and knock some sense into him for hurting you." Chloe let out a short, sad laugh. "No need, Lois. It wasn't his fault. Actually, I think he was just being honest with me. He doesn't feel the same about me, and I guess it's for the best." Lois was silent for a few seconds before sighing. "Still, Chloe, he had no right to put you through this. You deserve someone who truly loves you, you know." "I know, Lois. But I still want him to take me to the spring dance. Even though we're not a couple anymore, he's still one of my best friends." Chloe smiled, though her heart was heavy. Lois huffed on the other end. "You're way too strong, you know that? I don't know how you can handle all this and still want him to go to the dance with you." Chloe wiped her tears, trying to calm down. "I can't just erase how I feel, Lois. Clark is still important to me, and I don't want to lose his friendship, even if it's not the way I hoped." Lois sighed again. "All right, cuz. I just want you to know I'm here for you, and if you need anything, you can call me. You're not alone in this." "Thank you, Lois. I really needed to talk to you." "Anytime, Chloe. And remember, you deserve someone who makes you truly happy, with no half-truths." Lois tried to offer some comfort to her cousin. "I know. I'll be okay, I promise." Chloe forced a small smile, even though she knew Lois couldn't see it. "All right. Now go get some rest, okay? And if you need anything, call me again. Love you, cuz." "Love you too, Lois." The Smallville cemetery was quiet that afternoon, a solemn place marked by the gentle sound of the wind rustling through the trees and stirring the leaves. Whitney stood with his head bowed before his father's coffin, which was slowly being lowered into the ground. His eyes were red, but he did his best to stay strong. Lana stood beside him, holding his hand tightly. She looked at Whitney, then at the coffin, feeling the weight of the moment. Around them, a few friends and family members stood in silence, offering their support with their silent presence. Clark, Chloe, and Pete were there, watching from a distance, respecting their friend's pain. "I know he'd be proud of you, Whitney," Lana said, breaking the silence. Her voice was soft, trying to offer some comfort amid the sorrow. "You were a good son to him. And he always knew that." Whitney took a deep breath, looking at Lana, trying to hold back the tears. I don't know what I'm going to do now, Lana. He was always my role model, my hero. His voice broke, and he squeezed Lana's hand harder. Lana moved closer, wrapping Whitney in a hug. You'll find your way, Whitney. I believe in you. And you're not alone. I'll be here always. Clark had no particular feeling but stayed silent, using his sunglasses, respecting Whitney's pain. He looked at Chloe beside him, who was also visibly moved. It's hard to see a friend go through this, Chloe said, looking at Clark. I wish I could do more for him. Being here makes a big difference, Chloe. Sometimes it's all we can do, Clark replied, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. Pete stood just behind them, observing in silence. Whitney's a strong guy. He'll get through this, eventually. But for now, he needs all of us. As the priest gave the final prayer, Whitney's friends stayed close. They all understood the pain of loss and the gravity of the moment. The sun began to set on the horizon, casting an orange glow over the cemetery, adding to the melancholy of the farewell. Lana held Whitney's hand as the coffin was finally lowered. You're not alone, Whitney. We're all here for you. Whitney only nodded, unable to find words, but grateful for his friend's presence and the strength Lana gave him. After the burial, the mood was still heavy for everyone. Whitney and Lana decided to stay a little longer at the cemetery, while Clark said his goodbyes and walked to his truck, with Chloe and Pete following close behind. Clark was silent, reflecting on everything that had happened. He knew he still had something important to resolve and needed to do it as soon as possible. After dropping Pete and Chloe off at home, he made a decision. He needed to go to the Luther mansion. The drive to the mansion was quick, the engine of the truck purring softly as he sped through the deserted roads of Smallville. Vroom. Upon arriving at the Luther mansion, Clark parked the truck and walked up to the main entrance. He was greeted by one of the security guards, who recognized him and let him in without issue. Clark followed the corridors to Lex's office, where he knocked lightly on the door before entering. Knock knock, Clark. What brings you here at this hour? Lex asked, looking up from the papers he was reviewing. We need to talk, Lex. I thought it would be better to come in person, Clark said, closing the door behind him and stepping closer to Lex's desk. Lex frowned, intrigued. About what exactly? About your investigations. I know you're looking into things related to the meteor shower. Aliens, ships. I need you to stop. Lex raised an eyebrow, surprised. Clark, why does this concern you so much? I'm just trying to understand what happened here in Smallville. There are so many unanswered questions. Clark sighed, knowing he needed to act now. He moved closer to Lex, placing a hand on his shoulder. Lex, you haven't found anything relevant. There are no aliens, just fictional stories. It's all just people's imagination. Lex blinked, confused, as Clark's hand held a faint glow. His eyes seemed to lose focus for a moment, and he relaxed in his chair. Yeah, maybe I went a bit too far. Aliens, spaceships. It all sounds a bit absurd, doesn't it? Clark nodded, keeping his voice calm. Exactly. There's nothing outside of movies, Lex. It's better to focus on real things, on issues you can actually solve. Lex smiled slightly, as if waking up from a dream. You're right, Clark. I guess I got carried away by curiosity. I'll stop this investigation. Clark patted Lex's shoulder, relieved. I'm glad to hear that, Lex. You have other important things to focus on. Lex nodded, turning his attention back to the papers on his desk. Thanks for coming, Clark. I needed to hear that from someone I trust. Clark smiled and stepped away, heading towards the door. I'll always be here for you, Lex. See you later. Lex waved as Clark left the office, feeling strangely relieved, as if a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. Clark, on the other hand, knew he had done what was necessary to protect his secret and keep Lex away from any truth about aliens. Lana was alone at the talon, arranging some cups on the counter while the place remained relatively empty. She sighed, occasionally glancing at the door as if expecting someone. Suddenly, the cafe door opened, and Whitney walked in, carrying a small wooden box in his hands. Whitney, Lana said, surprised to see him. What are you doing here? Whitney approached her, looking serious but with a soft smile. I wanted to show you something. He placed the box on the counter and opened it, revealing several old medals. Lana's eyes widened as she looked at the medals. "These are your father's?" Whitney nodded, his eyes shining with emotion. "Yes. He fought in the Vietnam War. I found them while going through his things. I thought it would be good to remember what he did, what he sacrificed." Lana looked at Whitney, her expression full of tenderness. "He was a very brave man, Whitney. And you should be proud of that." Whitney sighed, looking at the medals. "I know. I think I'm starting to realize that life is more than football and trying to be popular. My dad sacrificed so much, and all I did was worry about small things." Lana smiled, touching Whitney's hand gently. "You're maturing, Whitney. And your dad, wherever he is surely very proud of you." Whitney looked at Lana, his eyes full of gratitude. "Thank you, Lana. You always know what to say." Lana smiled, still holding his hand. "I'll always be here for you, Whitney. You're not alone." Whitney gave a small smile, feeling a bit of peace amidst the storm of emotions he was going through. "I know. And I appreciate that." Clark was in the kitchen of the farmhouse, sitting at the table, while Martha and Jonathan prepared dinner. The smell of homemade food filled the air, bringing a sense of comfort. Martha looked at Clark, noticing the thoughtful expression on her son's face. "Clark, is everything okay? You seem a little distant today," Martha said, her voice soft with concern. "It's all fine, Mom. Just thinking about a few things," Clark replied, giving a slight smile to reassure her. Jonathan approached the table, placing a plate in front of Clark. "Want to talk about it, son?" Clark looked at his dad and smiled. "Actually, I was just noticing the weather's changing. I think there's going to be a storm soon." Jonathan frowned, looking out the window. "The weather does seem to be getting strange. I hope it's nothing too serious." Martha smiled, placing a hand on Clark's shoulder. "Well, with you around, I'm sure that whatever happens, we'll be safe." Clark smiled back, trying to hide his concern. "Of course, Mom. I'll make sure nothing bad happens." Jonathan nodded, sitting down at the table next to Clark. "That's right, son. We trust you. We always have." Clark picked up his fork and started eating, feeling the support of his parents and the weight of his responsibility. He knew that with the changing weather, there would be something to deal with, but at that moment, the company of his parents was exactly what he needed. The following day, at Luther Corp in Smallville, a helicopter landed in the outdoor yard of the factory, kicking up dust and making a deafening noise. Lionel Luther stepped out of the helicopter, dressed in an impeccable suit, his gaze determined as he walked towards the building. Lex was waiting for him, a tense smile on his face. "Dad, I'm glad you came. I think the employees deserve recognition for the excellent work they've done. Profits have increased considerably," Lex said, trying to keep the conversation positive. Lionel gave a forced smile, not stopping as he walked. "I'll try not to disappoint, Lex." Lionel walked to an improvised stage set up outdoors, where the factory employees were gathered. He climbed the stage, took the microphone, and looked out at the crowd. "I want to thank you all for the excellent performance. You've done an incredible job, and Luther Corp's profits have never been higher. Thank you very much for your efforts," Lionel said, with a calculated smile on his face. The employees applauded, happy with the recognition. Clap, clap, clap. Lionel then raised a hand, asking for silence. "However, there's a necessary change. Unfortunately, I'll be closing this factory. You're all laid off as of today." The smiles disappeared from the employees' faces, and a wave of outraged murmurs spread through the crowd. "What?" Lionel's expression didn't change. He handed over the microphone and stepped off the stage, walking towards the helicopter again. Lex, visibly furious, quickly approached Lionel, stopping in front of him. "Dad, this is a mistake. You can't do this to these people. They trusted you, they trusted us." Lionel gave a cold smile, placing a hand on Lex's shoulder. "This was merely your training ground, Lex. It's time to come home. Businesses are run with the mind, not the heart." Lionel continued walking towards the helicopter, leaving Lex behind, frustrated and speechless. The sound of the rotor blades soon filled the air again as Lionel took off, leaving only chaos and disappointment behind. Lana was running down the road, the strong wind blowing her hair as she approached the bus stop where Whitney was, a backpack slung over one shoulder. Whitney stood there, looking at the horizon, waiting for the bus to arrive. He seemed determined, but there was also sadness in his eyes. "Whitney!" Lana shouted, urgency in her voice as she approached him. "Please don't do this. Don't enlist." Whitney turned to look at Lana, his eyes softening when he saw her. "Lana, I have to do this. I need to find a purpose. My dad was always a hero to me, and I need to follow in his footsteps." Lana stopped in front of him, out of breath, trying to find the right words. "Whitney, you don't need to do this to prove anything to anyone. You're already a hero. You matter to me, to all of us here. Don't go." Whitney lowered his gaze, clearly moved by Lana's words. "I know you care, Lana. And I care about you more than anything. But I need to do this for me. I need to find out who I am and what I can do for the world." Lana held Whitney's hand, her eyes brimming with tears. "And what if you don't come back, Whitney? I don't know if I can bear that." Whitney took a deep breath, gently squeezing her hand. "I'll come back, Lana. I promise I'll come back. But I can't just stay here and do nothing. I need this for myself." Lana shook her head, trying to hold back the tears. I just don't want to lose you." Whitney gave a sad smile, stepping closer and wrapping Lana in a tight embrace. "You'll never lose me, Lana. I'll carry you with me in my heart every day." Lana clung to him, but soon heard the sound of the bus approaching. She knew she couldn't change Whitney's decision. When the bus stopped next to them, Whitney pulled away from the hug, looking at Lana one last time. "I love you, Lana. Never forget that." Lana tried to smile, but tears were streaming down her face. "I love you too, Whitney. Please take care." Whitney nodded, picked up his backpack, and got on the bus. Lana stood there, watching as he moved away, her heart heavy. The bus started to move, and Whitney waved at her from the window, his gaze full of determination and sadness. Lana waved back, even with a broken heart. She knew this was Whitney's choice, but it didn't make the goodbye any less painful. She stood there, watching the bus disappear down the road, the wind still blowing strongly around her, as a tear silently slid down her cheek. Clark was standing in an open field, watching the sky closely. The dark clouds were moving slowly, signaling an approaching storm. He knew he had to act to prevent any problems in Smallville, especially considering there were only 2 hours left until the spring dance. Clark took a deep breath, feeling the air around him getting colder as the clouds gathered. He then prepared, filling his lungs and releasing his freezing breath toward the clouds. Whoosh! The cold air spread quickly, freezing the moisture and dissipating the threatening clouds. Gradually, the darkened sky began to clear, revealing the sun through the spaces previously covered by clouds. "No storm, at least not in Smallville," Clark muttered, watching the result of his actions. He felt relieved to have managed to control the situation without causing more problems. With a quick move, Clark used his super speed to return to the farm. Whoosh! Lex was at his mansion, waiting to receive some factory workers and the executive board. Lex's idea was to buy the factory, and he was ready to present his proposal. "I'll gather 90% of the money," Lex said confidently, looking at the workers gathered in his office. One of the workers interrupted him, questioning the proposal. "And the other 10%? How are we going to raise that, Lex?" Lex remained calm, his voice firm as he explained. The other 10% would be raised by the workers, through mortgaging their homes. "I know this might seem risky, but I'm convinced that together, we can make this factory prosper." The workers exchanged worried looks as Lex continued. "I know I'm asking for a lot, but I'm willing to invest everything I have to save the factory. And if we work together, we can all benefit from this." There was a moment of silence as the workers considered the proposal. Lex knew he was taking a big risk, but he also knew this was the only way to keep the factory running and protect everyone's jobs. Clark drove to Chloe's house to pick her up for the spring dance. Despite having recently broken up, they had managed to maintain their friendship, and Clark was determined to make this night special for his friend. Clark parked the truck in front of Chloe's house and got out of the car. He walked to the door and knocked lightly. Knock knock. Chloe opened the door, wearing a beautiful blue dress, and smiled when she saw Clark. "Hi, Clark. You look great," she said, clearly happy to see him. "Thanks, Chloe. You look amazing," Clark replied, smiling back. He extended his arm and offered his hand. Ready for the dance? Chloe took his hand, but before leaving, she looked at Clark with a mix of timidity and hope. Clark, can I ask you for a favor? Clark frowned, curious. Of course, Chloe. What is it? Can you be my boyfriend again until the dance is over? Chloe asked, a little hesitant but with a hopeful smile. Clark was surprised by the request, but after a few seconds, he smiled softly. That's an odd request, Chloe. Chloe shrugged, still smiling. We're in Smallville, where weird is normal, remember? Clark sighed but then smiled more openly at Chloe. Yes, Chloe, we can be boyfriend and girlfriend until the dance is over. Chloe smiled, clearly relieved and grateful. Thank you, Clark. That means a lot to me. Shall we? We have a dance to enjoy, Clark said, leading her by the hand toward the truck. Chloe got into the car, and Clark walked around to get in as well. He started the engine, and in silence, the two headed to the school, ready to enjoy the night together. Clark parked the truck at the school, and both got out, ready to face the dance together. They walked to the school entrance, where colorful lights and music were already filling the atmosphere with energy. Clark looked at Chloe and smiled, gently squeezing her hand. Let's make this night unforgettable. Chloe nodded, smiling back. With you, Clark, I'm sure it will be. Lionel entered Lex's office unannounced, the sound of his firm steps echoing through the room. Lex, who was sitting behind his desk reviewing documents, looked up when he heard the door open. Father, what are you doing here? Lex asked, trying to hide the surprise in his voice. Lionel approached the desk, a cold smile on his face. Lex, I heard about your proposal to buy the factory. I was curious to see how you plan to pull that off. Lex raised an eyebrow, already aware of his father's disapproval. I'm gathering 90% of the necessary capital, and the workers would mortgage their homes to raise the other 10%. It's a chance to save their jobs, father. Lionel let out a sarcastic laugh, crossing his arms. Do you have the nerve, Lex, to gamble with the future of these poor men and their families? Risking everything for an ideal. Lex kept his gaze steady, standing up from his chair. I believe in them, father. And I believe that together, we can make this work. It's not just an ideal. It's about giving these people a chance. Lionel shook his head, the smile slowly fading. You've always been an idealist, Lex. But business isn't done with faith. It's done with numbers and forecasts. Do you think these men will be able to pay their mortgages if something goes wrong? Lex took a step forward, facing his father. I'd rather try and fail than just give up. These people deserve a chance. Lionel narrowed his eyes, his expression becoming more severe. You're making a mistake, Lex. And when this collapses, don't expect me to come to your rescue. Lex took a deep breath, maintaining his firm stance. I'm not expecting anything from you, father. I'll do this on my own. Lionel stared at Lex for a few more seconds, as if assessing him, before turning to leave. Very well, Lex. I hope you know what you're doing. Good luck. You'll need it. As soon as Lionel left the office, Lex let out a sigh, feeling the tension ease. He knew he was facing a big challenge, but he also knew he couldn't give up. Not now, not when so many people were counting on him. Clark was driving Chloe home after the spring dance. The atmosphere was calm inside the truck, and Chloe was looking out the window, a soft smile on her face. The night had been special, and both were satisfied with how they had enjoyed the moment together. It was an amazing night, Clark. Thank you for accepting my request, even if it was a little strange, Chloe said, breaking the silence, still looking at the city lights passing by the window. Clark gave a light smile, keeping his eyes on the road. I thought it made sense. You deserved a perfect end to the dance, and I wanted to be a part of that. Even after everything, I still feel like we have a special connection, you know? It might be different now, but it's still important, Chloe said, turning to him and watching his profile for a moment. Clark nodded, his smile widening. I think so too, Chloe. And I want this friendship to last. You're one of the most important people in my life, and I'll never stop caring about you. I know. And I really appreciate that, Clark. We've been through so much together, and I think it only makes us stronger, Chloe said, lightly touching Clark's arm. Clark parked the truck in front of Chloe's house, turning off the engine. He looked at her, his gaze serene and full of affection. "We're here. Are you sure you'll be okay?" "Yeah, I'll be fine. I just need some time to process everything. But, Clark, thank you for everything. You made this night unforgettable," Chloe said, opening the car door. "Anything you need, you know you can count on me." "I'll always be here," Clark said, looking at her warmly. "Thank you. See you in 3 months. Let's avoid contacting each other during that time," Chloe said, giving one last smile before getting out of the truck. Clark waved, watching as Chloe walked to her front door. He waited until she went inside, then started the engine again and drove off slowly. The soft hum of the engine filled the night silence as Clark reflected on the day and night's events. Despite all the challenges and difficulties, he knew he had done the right thing. And more importantly, he knew his friendship with Chloe would continue to be an important part of his life. Vroom. Clark drove back to the farm, feeling at peace. He knew he had made tough decisions, but at the end of the day, what mattered was being there for the people he loved and protecting them as best as he could. Kent Farm. Morning. Clark came downstairs, finding his parents in the kitchen. Martha was preparing breakfast, while Jonathan read the newspaper at the table. "Mom, Dad, I need to talk to you about something important," Clark said, standing next to the table. Martha looked up from the frying pan, while Jonathan lowered the newspaper, both curious. "Of course, son, what is it?" Jonathan asked. Clark approached and pulled out a chair, sitting down. "I've been thinking about traveling during the break. I think it would be good for me to explore more of the world, see new places, and have some time to reflect." Martha exchanged a worried look with Jonathan. "Traveling alone, Clark? I'm not sure that's a good idea." Clark gave a reassuring smile. "I understand your concern, Mom, but I think it's something I need to do. Besides, it would give you two some time alone. You could even go on a second honeymoon." Jonathan looked at Martha, considering Clark's words. "A second honeymoon, huh? It's been a while since we took a vacation together." Martha sighed, a bit hesitant, but seeing the determination in her son's eyes. "I don't like the idea of you traveling alone, Clark. But we have to trust you. If this is what you feel you need, then we support you." Jonathan nodded, placing a hand on Clark's shoulder. "Just be careful, son. We want you to enjoy yourself, but more importantly, we want you to be safe." Clark smiled, standing up from the chair. "Thanks, Mom. Thanks, Dad. I promise I'll be careful." He then headed upstairs to start packing. Martha looked at Jonathan, still with a concerned expression. "I don't like the idea of him traveling alone, but we have to trust him." "I know, Martha. He's grown, and he's finding his own path. We can only support him and trust that he knows what he's doing," Jonathan said, sighing. Clark stood on a deserted highway, surrounded by open fields that stretched to the horizon. The place was empty, with only the wind blowing across the lonely road. He had left the truck back at the farm, as he wouldn't need it for where he was going. "Jor-El, are you there?" Clark asked, looking up at the dark, cloud-filled sky. "I am here, Kal-El. I have the memories of future Clark, but, can I do this? Can I follow the right path? From the moment you do everything accordingly, you will succeed, Kal-El. Remember, you have the power and the knowledge. Trust in yourself." Clark took a deep breath, grateful for Jor-El's words. "Thanks, Jor-El. Now I just need to run, and run really fast." Clark positioned himself on the highway, ready to start. He leaned slightly forward, feeling the air around him grow heavier. Suddenly, he began to run, his feet moving faster and faster. Blue lightning began to spark around Clark as he ran, his body accelerating beyond human limits. He felt the speed force energy coursing through his body, the lightning intensifying as he gained speed. Whoosh. "You need to be faster, Kal-El," Jor-El's voice echoed in his mind. Clark pushed harder, the blue lightning intensifying as the world around him began to blur. The asphalt stretched beneath his feet, and the trees on the roadside seemed to bend and move in green blurs. Clark kept running, the world around him becoming a smear of light and shadow, until finally, a portal began to form in front of him, a swirling vortex of blue light and pulsing energy. Whoosh! The portal opened fully, and Clark dashed through it without hesitation, disappearing from the highway. Clark emerged from the portal into a completely different place. He found himself on a tropical island, surrounded by a vast, blue ocean. The white sand gleamed under the sun, and the sound of the waves crashing on the shore was calming. Tall, lush trees formed a dense forest further inland, and brightly colored birds flew over the treetops. Clark looked around, realizing there was no one there. The place seemed untouched, as if no human had set foot there for a long time. He took a deep breath, feeling the fresh, salty air. "I think it worked," Clark said, glancing around and feeling a mixture of relief and excitement. Clark then turned invisible, his body gradually fading until there was no visible trace of him left. He knew he had to be cautious, especially in an unfamiliar place. With his invisibility activated, Clark leaped into the air and began to fly. He rose above the trees, soaring over the island. From above, he had an even more impressive view of the place. The island was vast, with mountains covered in vegetation, waterfalls cascading down cliffs, and small lakes hidden among the trees. As he flew over the island, Clark began to notice some details. Statues of warrior women carved in stone were scattered in strategic locations, and he realized that the structures seemed ancient, as if they held a rich and deep history. Clark furrowed his brow, trying to remember something. He had seen descriptions of a place like this before, and then suddenly, it all made sense. This is Themyscira, Clark thought, excitement growing inside him. The island of the Amazons. The home of Wonder Woman. Clark smiled, feeling a rush of adrenaline and enthusiasm. He had always been curious about Themyscira, a legendary place that few had the chance to see. Being here, even accidentally, was a unique opportunity. "Wow, this is going to be interesting," Clark said, still invisible, as he continued to explore the island from the air, feeling his excitement grow with each second. Clark flew over the island for a while, until he spotted the first inhabitants. Amazons, wearing gleaming armor and determined expressions, were patrolling an area near what appeared to be a training field. Clark paused in the air for a moment, reading the memories of the women. "No man has ever set foot here," Clark thought, impressed. "Diana is still here." Clark smiled to himself. "I arrived before Steve Trevor." Determined to find Diana, Clark cautiously flew across the island, still invisible. He soared over training grounds, magnificent gardens, and stone structures that appeared to be ancient temples. Every detail of the place seemed rich with history and power. Finally, Clark spotted Diana alone in a secluded clearing, swinging a sword as she practiced combat moves. She was focused, her movements graceful and powerful, the sword slicing through the air with precision. Clark landed softly among the nearby trees, watching Diana for a moment. He was captivated by her beauty and strength, the combination of power and grace in her movements. "A wonder of a woman," he murmured to himself, smiling. Clark deactivated his invisibility, reappearing among the trees. He took a step forward and began walking calmly toward Diana, maintaining a serene and friendly posture. He knew he had to be careful not to startle her or appear as a threat. As Clark approached, he felt his excitement grow. Finally, he was going to meet Diana, Wonder Woman, and learn more about this legendary place. Diana's POV, I woke up to the first rays of sunlight filtering through the leaves of the trees around my room. The sound of birds echoed across the island, bringing a sense of peace and renewal. Themyscira was a blessed place, where every day was a new opportunity to improve, to become stronger and more prepared for any challenge. I got out of bed, stretching my arms and feeling my muscles relax. Today was another day of training, but something inside me always sparked a bit of curiosity. I wondered what the world outside the limits of our island was like. The world of men, which we always heard about, seemed so distant, yet so full of mysteries and dangers. I wanted to understand what lay beyond, to know what separated us from them and what connected us. After having my breakfast, I walked to the training field, where my Aunt Antiope was already waiting for me. She was the general of the Amazons and, to me, a role model. Her teachings were rigorous, but they always had a clear purpose, to prepare me to face any challenge. I grabbed my sword and positioned my shield, taking a deep breath before facing Antiope. She smiled, her gaze determined, and I knew this would be an intense training session. It didn't take long for the swords to clash. Clang! Clang! The sound of metal clashing echoed through the clearing, each blow struck with precision. Antiope was fast, and I had to be even quicker to keep up with her movements. My muscles moved automatically, each block, each attack guided by the years of training I had received. My aunt constantly challenged me, making each session a test of endurance and skill. Clang. Finally, after several minutes, Antiope raised her hand, signaling for us to stop. We were both out of breath, but satisfied with the training. "Very well, Diana. You're getting better and better," she said with an approving smile. I responded with a smile, feeling proud of her words. After the training, I decided to go to a more secluded clearing, where I could practice alone. I liked that place, where the tranquility allowed me to focus on my thoughts and improve my moves. I grabbed my sword and began practicing, swinging it through the air and imagining the strikes I could land in battle. That's when something caught my attention. My senses sharpened, and I knew I was no longer alone. I heard footsteps approaching, light and careful, as if someone was trying not to be noticed. I quickly turned, raising my sword in the direction of whoever it was. As Clark approached, he felt his excitement grow. Finally, he was going to meet Diana, Wonder Woman, and discover more about this legendary place. Clark raised his hands in the air, trying to show that he wasn't a threat. He knew that the Amazons were known for their distrust of men, and he wanted to avoid any misunderstanding. "Hey, calm down. I'm not here to hurt anyone," he said. Diana quickly turned, raising her sword toward him, her eyes wide with surprise and suspicion. "Who are you? And how did you get here? No man should be able to set foot on Themyscira." Clark kept his hands raised, cautiously stepping forward. "My name is Clark. I got here by accident. I don't want to cause any trouble, I just want to talk." Diana observed him for a moment, still holding her sword up, evaluating every detail of the stranger before her. Her instincts told her he wasn't lying, but the presence of a man on the island was unprecedented. "You expect me to believe that you just accidentally ended up here?" Diana asked, not lowering her guard. "I know it sounds impossible, but it's the truth," Clark replied, keeping his gaze firm and sincere. "I'm different. I have special abilities. That's how I was able to get here." "Special abilities?" Diana looked Clark up and down, her gaze assessing every detail of the man in front of her. "Are you a warrior?" Clark sensed the tone in her voice, a mixture of suspicion and perhaps a hint of condescension. She seemed to doubt his abilities. "Not exactly like you Amazons. But I can defend myself if I have to," Clark said, smiling lightly as he slowly lowered his hands. Diana kept her eyes fixed on him, her expression serious and distrustful. She took a few steps forward, her sword still pointed at Clark. Her movements were firm and precise, her posture that of a warrior ready to strike at any moment. "You say you have special abilities, but I need to see that for myself. Prove it." Diana isn't the goddess of war yet, but from what I remember, she should have some of Zeus' power or something like that. "I'd better be careful and not rely too much on my past life's knowledge," Clark thought, watching her movements carefully. Clark decided to act. In an instant, he used his super speed. Whoosh. Before Diana could react, Clark took the sword from her hand and reappeared in front of her, now holding the sword pointed at her neck. Diana's expression changed immediately, her eyes wide with shock and disbelief. How did you do that?" Diana asked, her voice betraying her surprise. She had never seen anyone move that fast, and the sword, which just a second ago was firmly in her hand, was now in the possession of this stranger. "I told you I had special abilities. I'm not here to..." Thump. Diana tried to punch Clark, but he quickly dodged, leaning to the side. The surprise on her face turned to frustration, and she immediately attempted another strike. Whoosh. Clark dodged again, moving out of her reach with ease. Diana gritted her teeth, her expression hardening as she tried blow after blow, but Clark evaded every one of them effortlessly. Whoosh. Whoosh. Thump. Each frustrated attempt made Diana huff in anger. She had never encountered someone who could avoid her so easily. Clark remained calm, holding the sword in one hand as he smoothly moved to dodge her attacks. Finally, Clark decided to end the fight without hurting her. He stepped forward and with a quick motion, wrapped Diana in a firm embrace, pinning her arms to her sides. Diana struggled to free herself, but Clark held her tightly, without hurting her. "Let me go." Diana growled, pushing against his hold. Grunt. She tried to break free, tensing her muscles and pushing with her arms, but Clark was far stronger than she imagined. Diana squirmed, trying to get out of his grip, but she couldn't move. Diana then tried to pull back, preparing to headbutt Clark. "Don't do that, you'll hurt yourself," Clark said, trying to warn her. But Diana ignored the warning. With determination, she launched her head forward, attempting to strike Clark. Thud. Diana felt dizzy after the headbutt, stumbling slightly, while Clark remained unscathed, showing no sign of pain. He gently held her up, preventing her from falling. "I warned you," Clark said, concerned, as he kept her steady. Clark observed her for a moment, realizing that Diana was less civilized than he expected. She seemed more impulsive and determined to fight, without considering other options for dialogue. Diana finally recovered, and Clark released her, allowing her to step back. She raised a hand to her forehead, still feeling the impact of the headbutt. Clark then extended the sword toward her, offering it back. "Here's your sword. I really don't want to fight you." Diana looked at the sword in Clark's hand, still suspicious. She slowly took it, not taking her eyes off him, trying to understand who the stranger was and what he wanted there. "My name is Clark," he said, trying to ease the tension. "And you, what's your name?" "Diana," she replied, still maintaining a wary expression. "Are you a woman disguised as a man?" Clark's eyes widened, surprised and visibly embarrassed by the unexpected question. "I thought she couldn't hurt me more, but she managed to. Why would a woman disguise herself as a man?" Diana made a cute expression, her eyes slightly furrowed, as if deep in thought. "My mother says that men are vile, weak creatures who only think with the part below their waist. But you're strong, so I thought you might be a woman. Or maybe you just don't have a penis." Clark froze, utterly incredulous at the direct and unexpected statement from Diana. He couldn't believe what he had just heard. "I don't know what you expected, but you'd better stop assuming you know everyone just because you've seen them in your past life. In this universe, she's like this, so get over it, Kal-El." Clark sighed, trying to regain his composure. "Who's your mother?" Diana raised her chin with pride. "My mother is Queen Hippolyta, and she's always taught us that men are weak and selfish." Clark decided to act before she could resist again. In a swift move, he picked her up in his arms. "What are you doing? Put me down." Diana protested, surprised and indignant. Whoosh. Clark took off, flying with Diana in his arms. The wind blew around them as they rapidly ascended, and Diana's eyes widened, amazed by the height. "By Hera's name, how are you doing this? Are you a god?" Diana asked, the surprise evident in her voice as she looked at the landscape below them. Clark smiled slightly. "I'm pretty sure your mother didn't say that about men." Clark looked at Diana, trying to reassure her as they flew over Themyscira. He wanted her to understand that he wasn't there to cause any harm. "I'm not a god, Diana," Clark replied calmly. "But I have abilities that make me different from ordinary humans. I just want to show you that I'm not a threat, and that we can talk without fighting." Diana continued to watch Clark with suspicion, but now there was a mix of curiosity in her expression. She looked out at the horizon, seeing the shimmering waters surrounding the island and the vast ocean stretching as far as the eye could see. "You are different, Clark," she said, her voice a bit softer. "But I still don't understand what you're doing here, and why no man is supposed to set foot on this island." Clark lowered their altitude, slowly descending until they landed in a clearing, letting Diana stand on her own. He stepped back a little, giving her space. "I ended up here by accident while trying to explore the world and understand more about myself. I didn't intend to invade your territory or cause any trouble." Clark was lying. The truth was, he had always been curious about Themyscira and Wonder Woman. Though it wasn't exactly how he imagined, he was still pleased to have found the island and to have finally met Diana. This wasn't the version he knew from his past life, but that only made things more interesting. His first multiverse journey had been a success. Diana observed him closely, her gaze assessing. She didn't know if she could trust this man, but something about his posture and words sparked curiosity in her. "I've always wanted to explore the world of men," Diana finally said, lowering her sword, though still with some caution in her voice. "My mother taught us that men are weak and selfish creatures, but I feel there's more out there. I've always wanted to understand what truly lies beyond Themyscira." Clark noticed the sincerity in her voice and stepped forward slightly, offering a gentle smile. "You're right to want to discover for yourself. There's a lot in the world beyond what we're told. And not everything is as we've been taught." He paused, looking at Diana. "I can help you understand the world of men, if you'll let me. I can show you that not everything is as your mother described." Diana still seemed hesitant, but the curiosity in her eyes was clear. She wanted to know more, to explore and understand. And maybe, just maybe, this stranger could be the key to that. Clark frowned suddenly, his expression becoming alert. He tilted his head slightly, activating his super hearing. Amid the forest silence, he could unmistakably hear the sound of horse hooves approaching. Gallop! Gallop! Clark looked at Diana, noticing she hadn't yet picked up on the approach. "Someone's coming," he said, his voice low and careful. Diana furrowed her brows, clearly intrigued. "How do you know that?" Clark raised his hands in the air, trying to show he wasn't a threat. "Special abilities." Diana looked at him, confused, but before she could say anything, two Amazons appeared in the clearing. Both were mounted on imposing horses, and anger was visible on their faces as they saw Clark. "A man on Themyscira?" one of them exclaimed, her voice filled with disdain and surprise. The other Amazon gripped her spear firmly, her gaze full of fury. "Diana, what's going on here? How does this man dare to step onto our sacred land?" Diana raised her hand, signaling for the Amazons to stand down. "I'll take him to the Queen. He is my prisoner. There doesn't need to be violence here." The two Amazons exchanged glances, still clearly distrustful and furious, but lowered their weapons, heeding Diana's command. They had been sent by the Queen to find Diana, and now had to deal with the unexpected presence of a man. "If he tries anything, we won't hesitate to end him," one said in a threatening tone. Diana nodded, keeping her firm stance. "Understood. I'll make sure he is taken directly to the Queen." Clark remained silent, his hands raised, as Diana approached him, positioning herself behind him as if ready to escort him. He knew this was the best way to avoid a confrontation and perhaps gain some understanding from the Amazons. Diana looked at one of the Amazons and nodded. "I need a horse. Let's take him to the Queen immediately." The Amazon nodded and dismounted, handing the reins to Diana. Diana gripped the reins firmly and mounted the horse with agility, then looked at Clark. "Get on behind me. Don't try anything stupid," Diana said, looking at Clark distrustfully. Clark nodded, showing he understood. He approached the horse and, with a quick leap, got on behind Diana, holding onto the saddle firmly but trying to keep a respectful distance to avoid disturbing her. The two Amazons exchanged glances again, still distrustful, but then both mounted the other horse together. One held the reins while the other kept the spear ready, prepared for any eventuality. Diana gave the reins a gentle tug, and the horse began moving, leading Clark and the Amazons through the dense forest. The sound of hooves echoed among the trees as the group advanced toward the heart of Themyscira, where the Queen awaited them. Clark stayed silent during the ride, aware that he was in enemy territory and that any wrong move could be interpreted as a threat. He just observed the landscape around him, admiring the untouched beauty of the island. Diana, meanwhile, remained focused, her eyes on the path ahead. Despite her suspicions about Clark, something about his presence piqued her curiosity. He didn't seem like the men her mother had always warned her about, but she couldn't let her guard down just yet. As they rode, the group passed areas filled with statues and ancient monuments, reminders of past battles and a legacy the Amazons fiercely protected. Clark looked at these symbols of history and power, realizing how special this place was. Finally, after some time, the group began to approach the grand city of Themyscira. The towering structures and marble spires gleamed under the sun, and Clark could see various Amazons watching them as they approached, their expressions ranging from surprise to disapproval. Diana brought the horse to a stop before the main palace, where a group of Amazons awaited. She dismounted and gestured for Clark to do the same. "You'll be taken to Queen Hippolyta. And remember, any suspicious move and they won't hesitate to act." Clark nodded, carefully dismounting. "I understand. I'm just here to talk." Diana gave a small nod, then gestured for the other Amazons to escort him. They positioned themselves beside Clark, ready to take him into the palace, with Diana leading the way. Clark took a deep breath as he walked through the palace gates. He knew he needed to be cautious and was about to face one of the biggest challenges of his life. earning the trust of the Amazons and, most importantly, Queen Hippolyta. Clark was led to the grand hall of the palace, where Queen Hippolyta sat on an ornate throne. Beside her stood Antiope, the general of the Amazons, watching the scene with a serious and attentive gaze. As soon as Clark entered, all eyes turned to him. "Diana, who is this man, and how does he dare step on our sacred land?" Hippolyta asked, her voice firm and filled with authority. "Mother," he introduced himself as Clark. "He claims he arrived here by accident and doesn't intend to harm anyone," Diana replied, maintaining a respectful posture. Clark stayed silent but discreetly activated his ability to read minds, focusing on Hippolyta. He immediately sensed the queen's thoughts, her desire to protect Themyscira at all costs and a deep-seated intention to eliminate any threat, including him. "The presence of a man is an affront to our security. I can't allow this to continue." Clark swallowed, realizing the danger he was in. He knew he needed to do something to prove he wasn't a threat. Hippolyta raised her hand, signaling for Diana to approach. "Diana, use the lasso of truth. Let's see if this man is really telling the truth." Diana nodded and walked over to a nearby table, picking up the golden lasso. She then approached Clark, with an expression that mixed determination and slight reluctance. "This is the lasso of truth," Diana said, looking directly into Clark's eyes. "Anyone bound by it is compelled to tell the truth. There's no resisting its power." Clark looked at the lasso, feeling a chill down his spine. He knew he couldn't lie while under the power of that artifact. Even though he had good intentions, he couldn't deny that he feared what might happen if his answers weren't enough to convince them. Jor-El interrupted his thoughts, his voice echoing in Clark's mind. "Kal-El, remember, your mind is protected. The lasso of truth can't force you to do anything you don't want to. Trust yourself." Clark felt a wave of relief wash over him as he heard Jor-El's voice. He took a deep breath, relaxing a bit and looking at Diana with a calmer gaze. "I just hope you trust me after hearing my answers," Clark said with a light smile, trying to project confidence. Diana observed Clark for a moment before finally wrapping the lasso of truth around him. The Amazons around them watched in silence, observing Clark's every move, ready to act if he tried anything. "Now answer, Clark," Diana said firmly. "What is your true intention on Themyscira?" Clark looked directly into Diana's eyes, feeling the lasso's power around him but with his confidence restored thanks to Jor-El. "My intention is only to see this place and learn more about you, Amazons. I have no intention of hurting anyone or causing trouble." Diana continued to look at him, assessing his words. She could feel the sincerity in his voice, and the lasso of truth showed no sign of resistance or deceit. She then looked at her mother, waiting for the queen's reaction. Hippolyta kept her gaze fixed on Clark for a few moments before finally speaking. "We'll allow him to stay for now. But know this, man, you'll be watched at all times. Any sign of betrayal, and your life will be taken without hesitation." Clark nodded respectfully. "I understand, Queen Hippolyta. I'll do my best to earn your trust." Hippolyta gestured for the Amazons to release Clark. "Diana, you'll be responsible for him during his stay. Don't let him out of your sight." Diana nodded, still holding a certain distrust in her gaze. "Yes, Mother. I'll make sure he doesn't cause any trouble." Clark felt the lasso being removed from his body and sighed in relief. He knew this was only the beginning, but at least he had gained a chance to prove he wasn't a threat. He looked at Diana, who now stood beside him, and gave a slight smile. "Thank you for trusting me, even if just a little," Clark said. Diana looked at him, still serious but with a hint of curiosity in her expression. "We'll see if that trust is deserved, Clark. There's still much to discover about you." Clark nodded, knowing he'd need patience and determination to earn the trust of the Amazons and show that his presence there wasn't a threat, but an opportunity for mutual understanding. He was willing to do whatever it took to earn that respect, starting with Diana and her mother, Queen Hippolyta. Clark was escorted by Diana to a more isolated part of the palace complex, where the accommodations for visitors and prisoners were located. Instead of a luxurious room, Clark was taken to a small stone cell. The door was made of iron, and the interior was simple, with only a rudimentary bed and a narrow window high on the wall, letting in only a small amount of sunlight. Diana looked at Clark as he examined his surroundings. "This will be your accommodation while you're here. I hope it's sufficient for you." Clark kept a calm expression, observing every detail of the cell. Internally, he was clearly frustrated. The bed was little more than a piece of wood with a thin layer of straw, and the faint light from the window made the place feel dark and uncomfortable. Still, he didn't let his feelings show. Clark knew he needed to stay calm and prove he wasn't a threat. "It'll do, Diana. I'm grateful not to have been treated worse," Clark replied, trying to keep his tone friendly. Diana observed him for a moment, as if trying to gauge his true intentions. "I hope you really are telling the truth, Clark. For your own good and ours." Clark nodded, giving a slight smile. "I just want to show that you can trust me. I'll adapt to any circumstance." Diana turned around, preparing to leave. "I'll leave guards watching this area. If you need anything, don't hesitate to ask them. But remember, any sign that you're trying to escape, and we won't hesitate to act." "Understood," Clark said, keeping a calm demeanor. Diana left, closing the iron door behind her. The sound of the metal creaking echoed through the small cell, leaving Clark alone. He sighed and sat on the rudimentary bed, immediately feeling the discomfort. He looked at the narrow window high on the wall, trying to find some comfort in the faint sunlight that streamed through. Clark remembered Steve Trevor, the first man to reach Themyscira. He recalled that, in the movie, Steve had much better accommodations than he did. Steve got lucky, Clark thought, letting out a sigh as he looked around his cold, uncomfortable cell. Even so, he knew his goal was far more complex than comfort. He needed to prove himself trustworthy. Diana's point of view, I left Clark's cell, maintaining a serious expression as I walked through the palace corridors. However, inside, an excitement I could hardly control began to grow. I had never had the opportunity to talk to anyone from outside the island. It was a new and curious feeling that I needed to hide from the other Amazons. I should be indifferent, impartial, but it was impossible to deny that there was something fascinating about the presence of that man. As I passed the marble pillars and tapestries decorating the palace halls, I felt conflicted. Part of me wanted to believe Clark's words, while the other part, trained since childhood to distrust men, remained vigilant. I reached the corridor leading to my mother's room, Queen Hippolyta. I paused for a moment before the large carved wooden door, taking a deep breath before raising my hand to knock. Knock, knock. I waited a few seconds, feeling my heart beating a bit faster than usual. I was anxious to tell my mother about Clark, about what had happened, and to hear what she thought. "Come in," said my mother's firm, authoritative voice from the other side of the door. I opened the door slowly, entering the room. My mother was seated at a table, looking over some scrolls, but she raised her eyes to me as soon as I entered. She always had an imposing posture, an aura of strength that made everyone around her know they were in the presence of a true leader. "Mother," I began, trying to keep my voice steady. "I left Clark in the cell, but don't you think we should keep him somewhere better? We should treat him as a guest. We've already tested the lasso of truth on him and have no reason to worry." I sighed, stepping forward. "I understand, Mother. But he showed sincerity. And besides, he didn't resist the lasso of truth. Maybe we can learn something from him, or even discover that not all men are as we imagine." Hippolyta kept a serious gaze, but had a hint of reflection in her eyes. "Regardless of what he says, Diana, he cannot stay here. Soon, we will decide how to expel him from the island. I don't want to risk our security." I felt a tightness in my chest, but I kept a firm expression. "If that's your decision, Mother, I'll respect it. But I still believe we can learn something important from him." Hippolyta gave a slight nod. "We'll see what happens, Diana. But don't let your guard down. Men are unpredictable, and it's our duty to protect Themyscira at all costs." I left my mother's room, my mind full of thoughts and doubts. I needed to keep Clark under control, but I also wanted to understand who he truly was. Perhaps there was something more to him, something that could change everything I believed about men and the world beyond our island. End of Diana's point of view. Hours passed until Diana decided to visit Clark in the cell again. She felt curious about him, something she could no longer ignore. Diana knew she needed to keep control, but she couldn't deny that she wanted to understand more about the world of men and the powers Clark claimed to have. Clark, for his part, was bored. He sat on the wooden bed, looking at the narrow window when he heard footsteps approaching. When the cell door opened, he saw Diana enter, her expression curious, though she tried to hide it. "You again? I thought I'd only have the guards company here," Clark said, giving a light smile. Diana crossed her arms, looking at him. I came because I have some questions. I want to understand more about you, the world of men, and your abilities. Clark gestured for Diana to sit beside him on the bed, giving her some space. Of course, ask what you want. I'll answer as best I can. Diana hesitated for a moment, but eventually approached and sat beside him, keeping a certain distance. She looked at Clark, trying to decipher every detail of his expression. You said you arrived here by accident, but what exactly were you doing? Why come so far? Clark took a deep breath, thinking of the best way to answer. I wanted to see different places, to understand more about the world. I have abilities that allow me to travel great distances quickly, and that's how I ended up here. I had no idea I'd find an island like Themyscira. Diana frowned, still trying to understand. And these abilities? You said you're not a god. So where do your powers come from? Clark looked at the narrow window, seeing a bit of the blue sky outside. I'm not exactly like ordinary humans. I come from a different place, a planet called Krypton. My powers come from Earth's yellow sun, which gives me strength, speed, and other abilities. Diana's eyes widened, clearly surprised. Another planet? So you're an alien? Alien? Clark frowned, visibly surprised. Asterisk, how would someone who lives in isolation know that scientific term? Asterisk, he thought. Yes, men who come from the stars, Diana said, sounding unimpressed. Clark noticed that whenever Diana spoke about places outside the island, she only mentioned men. There was never any mention of women living outside Themyscira. He frowned slightly, intrigued. Clark looked at Diana as she spoke about men coming from the stars. Out of curiosity, he decided to activate his mind-reading ability to understand what was going through her head. He closed his eyes for a moment, focusing on Diana's mind, and suddenly her thoughts began to flow. Diana was reflecting on everything her mother had taught her. She firmly believed that men were corrupt beings, capable of anything for power and destruction. Women outside Themyscira were subjugated, influenced by the cruelty and selfishness of men. Clark's frown deepened as he realized the rigidity of Diana's beliefs. But it was when he picked up the most curious thought of all. Diana believed she had been molded from clay, brought to life by the goddess Hera herself. Clark couldn't help but smile in amusement. Asterisk, she really believes that. Molded from clay? And all these ideas about the outside world. It seems Queen Hippolyta did a great job keeping Diana far from the truth, asterisk, he thought, finding Diana's innocence fascinating and at the same time concerning. Slap. A light slap on Clark's arm brought him out of his thoughts. Diana was glaring at him, clearly irritated. What are you laughing at? It's not polite to laugh while I'm talking about something serious. Sorry. Clark raised his hands, still smiling, trying to explain himself. I'm not laughing at you, Diana. Clark looked at Diana, noticing the genuine curiosity in her eyes, but also the intensity of her beliefs. He knew that revealing the full truth about his origin and powers might be too much for her to accept at once. Moreover, the Amazon distrust of men made everything even more complicated. He decided that, for now, it was better to keep certain information secret. There's a lot about me that's hard to explain, especially to someone who's never left this island, Clark said, softening his expression. But I hope that, in time, you can understand who I truly am. Diana stared at him, her curiosity increasingly evident. She wanted to know more about the world beyond Themyscira, especially since Clark seemed so evasive about himself. Perhaps, if she asked about the outside, he'd feel more comfortable talking. And what about the world out there? What's it like living outside of Themyscira? Diana asked, trying to sound casual, though her eyes revealed a glimmer of anticipation. Clark smiled slightly, understanding what she was trying to do. He knew Diana was using an indirect approach to get information about him. The problem was that he didn't know exactly what was happening outside the island, having come from another universe. All he had was a vague suspicion that this era might coincide with World War I. Clark discreetly pointed toward the cell gate, where two guards stood watch vigilant. Maybe we can have this conversation without an audience, Clark suggested, trying to keep a friendly tone. Diana frowned, confused. She looked at the guards, then back at Clark, trying to understand what he really wanted. On the one hand, her curiosity about the outside world tempted her to talk with him alone. On the other hand, she knew she shouldn't hide anything from her Amazon sisters. It was against her principles and could be seen as a betrayal of her mother's and the other warriors' trust. She hesitated for a moment, but curiosity ultimately prevailed. Diana stood up and walked over to the guards, trying not to appear undecided. "I need you to step away for a moment," she said, keeping her voice firm. The guards exchanged glances and shook their heads in refusal. "We're here under orders from the Queen, Princess," one of them replied, her voice filled with determination. "We can't leave the prisoner unsupervised." Clark then looked at Diana, noticing the genuine curiosity in her eyes, but also the intensity of her beliefs. He knew that revealing the full truth about his origin and powers might be too much for her to accept at once. Moreover, the Amazon distrust of men made everything even more complicated. He decided that, for now, it was better to keep certain information secret. "There's a lot about me that's hard to explain, especially to someone who's never left this island," Clark said, softening his expression. "But I hope that, in time, you can understand who I truly am." Diana stared at him, her curiosity increasingly evident. She wanted to know more about the world beyond Themyscira, especially since Clark seemed so evasive about himself. Perhaps, if she asked about the outside, he'd feel more comfortable talking. "And what about the world out there? What's it like living outside of Themyscira?" Diana asked, trying to sound casual, though her eyes revealed a glimmer of anticipation. Clark smiled slightly, understanding what she was trying to do. He knew Diana was using an indirect approach to get information about him. The problem was that he didn't know exactly what was happening outside the island, having come from another universe. All he had was a vague suspicion that this era might coincide with World War I. Clark discreetly pointed toward the cell gate, where two guards stood watch vigilant. "Maybe we can have this conversation without an audience," Clark suggested, trying to keep a friendly tone. Diana frowned, confused. She looked at the guards, then back at Clark, trying to understand what he really wanted. On the one hand, her curiosity about the outside world tempted her to talk with him alone. On the other hand, she knew she shouldn't hide anything from her Amazon sisters. It was against her principles and could be seen as a betrayal of her mother's and the other warriors' trust. She hesitated for a moment, but curiosity ultimately prevailed. Diana stood up and walked over to the guards, trying not to appear undecided. "I need you to step away for a moment." The guards exchanged glances and shook their heads in refusal. "We're here under orders from the Queen, Princess," one of them replied, her voice filled with determination. "We can't leave the prisoner unsupervised." "Unsupervised?" Diana asked, with a look of displeasure. "I am the Princess of Themyscira and the best among all warriors. No one is more capable than I am to guard this prisoner. Step away." The guards exchanged glances again, reluctant, but eventually complied. They stepped away slowly, keeping a safe distance but moving out of direct sight of Clark and Diana. Diana returned to Clark, crossing her arms. "I fulfilled your request. The guards have stepped back. Now speak." Clark pondered for a moment, thinking about how to approach the topic without going into detail about his true origin. He knew the best way to handle this was to speak superficially, giving a general idea of what was happening in the world, but without revealing too much. "The world out there is complicated," Clark began, choosing his words carefully. "There are places where people live in peace, but also places in conflict. In some areas, there are wars, while others enjoy harmony. The world is vast, and each part is different from the other." Diana looked thoughtful, absorbing Clark's words. She seemed to be reflecting on what he had said, and Clark got the impression that his answer wouldn't be enough to satisfy her curiosity. However, after a few seconds, Diana nodded, as if she'd reached a conclusion. So there is war in the world of men. Ares must be influencing these conflicts. That makes sense." Clark was visibly relieved to see that Diana was satisfied with his response. He relaxed a bit, allowing himself to breathe more calmly. In the end, everything revolves around the gods, Clark thought, shaking his head slightly. Diana suddenly stood up, a renewed determination in her eyes. "If Ares is behind these wars, we need to be prepared. I cannot allow him to continue causing destruction." Clark stood up, realizing that Diana was about to leave the cell. "Where do you think you're going?" Clark asked, trying to understand what was on the princess's mind. Diana looked at him firmly. "I'm going to speak with my mother. I want to ask permission to go to the world of men and help them fight Ares." Clark shook his head, finding the idea impulsive. Diana barely knows the world outside. She has no idea how to find what she's looking for. She would end up being captured or getting lost, he thought. You don't know the countries, nor do you have enough information. How do you think your mother, who, by the way, despises men and only cares about what happens on this island, will allow you to leave? Clark questioned, trying to make Diana think. Diana remained silent for a moment, absorbing Clark's words. She knew he was right, but the idea of stopping Ares and protecting the world of men motivated her to move forward. Even after considering it, she didn't reach a definitive conclusion. Determined, she decided she would need to speak to her mother regardless. Diana turned and left the cell without saying another word. Clark watched her go, still finding her decision impulsive. He knew that convincing Queen Hippolyta would be a challenge, and that Diana would need more than just determination to get what she wanted. Clark waited a few seconds, but seeing the cell open and unattended, he decided to follow Diana. He exited calmly, noticing Diana's confusion when she saw him just behind her. Diana stopped, frowning. "What are you doing? Why did you leave the cell?" Clark couldn't help but find her expression amusing. "Who usually stayed locked in cells?" he asked, with a playful smile. Diana crossed her arms, still confused. "The sisters who did something wrong. Sometimes, even I ended up locked up." Clark raised an eyebrow, surprised. "And no one ever tried to leave when the cell was open and without guards?" Diana shook her head, seeming offended by the suggestion. No Amazon would dare disobey the Queen's orders. Even if the cell were open, none of us would try to escape. Clark chuckled lightly, noticing the cultural difference between himself and the Amazons. "Well, maybe I'm not so different from the men your mother fears so much. I'm more curious and a bit less obedient." Diana watched him for a moment, her gaze still carrying suspicion but also curiosity. She didn't know what to expect from Clark, but one thing was certain. He wasn't like any man she had ever known, or at least that her mother had described. With a sigh, she shrugged and continued walking. "Just follow me, but don't you dare do anything that will make me change my mind about you." Clark nodded, following Diana toward the palace. He knew that gaining her and the Amazons' trust would take time, but he was determined to show that not all men were as they imagined. As they walked toward the palace, Diana led the way with firm steps, while Clark followed her in silence. Clark could hear the murmurs and hostile comments of the Amazons along the way. Some of them stared at him with looks full of disdain, muttering words of distrust and scorn about the presence of a man in Themyscira. "A man here? How disrespectful! How dare he set foot on our sacred land?" Clark chose to ignore the comments. He knew he wasn't welcome there and didn't want to make the situation worse. Diana also remained silent, focused on guiding him to the palace. She understood the reason for her sister's discomfort. When they reached the palace, one of Clark's cell guards stepped aside as they passed through the entrance. Clark noticed this detail and turned to Diana, speaking calmly. "It seems your mother already knows you went to the cell and dismissed the guards to talk to me." Diana looked at him, without showing surprise, and nodded slightly. She had already suspected that her mother, Queen Hippolyta, was aware of everything that was happening. The Queen's decisions were always quick and firm, especially when it came to protecting Themyscira. The two proceeded through the main corridor of the palace, finally arriving at the great hall where the Queen was. Hippolyta's expression appeared more irritated than the first time Clark had seen her. Beside the Queen was Antiope, the general of the Amazons, observing everything with a serious and attentive gaze. Diana stepped forward and bowed respectfully before her mother, and Clark imitated her, bowing in a gesture of respect. "Why have you brought this man before me again and dismissed the guards who were watching him while you spoke?" Queen Hippolyta asked, her voice laden with disapproval. "I wanted to speak to him privately, mother," Diana replied, keeping her head held high. "And I brought him here because there are important things happening in the outside world." Hippolyta and Antiope narrowed their eyes at Clark, as if trying to see through him, assessing every detail. Clark felt uncomfortable under their penetrating gazes, and his body tensed slightly while he remained still. "What important things are happening in the outside world that have you so concerned?" Hippolyta questioned, addressing Diana without looking away from Clark. "There's a war happening, Mother," Diana said, her voice filled with worry. "And I believe Ares is behind it, influencing men. We need to do something before the destruction spreads further." "It's no surprise that men are always at war, with or without Ares's help," Hippolyta replied, showing no surprise. "The nature of men is to destroy themselves, Diana. That doesn't change. Even if Ares is involved, it still has nothing to do with us or Themyscira." Clark remained silent, but mentally agreed with the Queen's words. He knew that human conflicts were often driven by ambition and weakness, without divine influence. However, he couldn't help but think that if Ares was indeed involved, things could get even worse. "Even so, Mother, I believe we shouldn't stand idle. We need to intervene, especially if Ares is truly involved," insisted Diana, her gaze determined. Hippolyta sighed, her expression hardening. "Diana, the role of the Amazons is to protect this island, not to meddle in the affairs of men. Our mission is to preserve peace in Themyscira, not to fight in the wars of the outside world. A queen's duty is to protect her people, not to take unnecessary risks." Diana frowned, clearly frustrated by her mother's words. "What good is it to protect the island if everything around us is destroyed?" she questioned, her voice filled with despair. "Maybe I don't want to be queen." Hippolyta looked at Diana with visible anger in her eyes, irritation evident in every line of her face. "Be careful what you say, Diana. Leadership responsibilities are not something one can abandon on a whim." Diana didn't reply, keeping her gaze firm, though the tension between the two was palpable. Hippolyta then turned to Clark, who observed the exchange between mother and daughter in silence. "Diana has always been reckless, but since you arrived, she seems to have gotten worse. You've spent too much time with this man, Diana." Clark wasn't surprised by the accusation. He knew he'd be seen as a negative influence, and it was normal for the blame for Diana's rebellious attitude to fall on him. He kept a calm and serene expression, not attempting to argue. He knew that any words now would only make things worse. Hippolyta turned her attention back to Diana, hoping her daughter understood the gravity of the situation. "Now, return to your post. And you, Clark, will be taken back to the cell and closely monitored. I will not allow any more rule violations." Clark raised an eyebrow and took a step forward, a slight smile on his face. "Do you know what a joke is?" Hippolyta frowned, her expression becoming slightly confused. She didn't seem to understand where Clark was going with this. Diana, on the other hand, seemed entirely unfamiliar with the term. "Joke?" Diana asked, looking at Clark with curiosity. Clark kept smiling, noticing their reaction. "Because yours are the best," he replied, letting out a laugh. Hippolyta, still confused, looked at Diana, who was trying to process Clark's words. Antiope, beside the queen, maintained a distrustful expression, clearly seeing no humor in the situation. Clark then looked at Diana, tilting his head slightly and asking in a curious tone, "Diana, how were you born?" Diana looked at him, surprised by the unexpected question, but soon replied with a certain pride, "My mother molded me from clay, and the goddess Hera gave me life." Clark pretended to be fascinated by her answer, nodding while keeping a light smile. "That's incredible," he said, trying to appear impressed, though he was inwardly amused by her naivety. Hippolyta watched the scene, a bad feeling beginning to grow within her. She knew Clark was manipulating Diana, or at least trying to plant doubts. The queen felt it needed to end before something worse happened. "Enough talking," Hippolyta said, her voice firm and authoritative. "Guards, escort him back to the cell immediately." 2 guards approached Clark, ready to escort him back. However, in the blink of an eye, Clark disappeared from where he stood and reappeared beside Hippolyta's throne. Whoosh. The guards exchanged glances, confused, searching for him. Diana's eyes widened, surprised at how quickly Clark moved. Hippolyta was visibly irritated, rising from her throne. Clark looked at the guards, smiling ironically. "Aren't you supposed to be imprisoning me? Seems like you're not doing a good job." Antiope, sensing the threat Clark posed, drew her sword and prepared to act. Clang. Diana took a step forward, her voice alarmed. "Clark, what are you doing near the—" Whoosh. Clark used his super speed once more, now appearing beside Diana before she could finish her sentence. "My mother? What are you talking about, Diana? I'm right here beside you." The guards quickly ran toward Hippolyta and Antiope, forming a defensive barrier around them. Hippolyta looked directly at Clark, her face showing anger and distrust. "What do you intend, man?" Clark walked calmly until he stood in front of the Queen, his hands relaxed at his sides. The guards raised their swords toward Clark, ready to attack at the slightest hint of a threat. Diana also moved closer to her mother, trying to understand the situation. Clark looked directly into Hippolyta's eyes, his expression serious and determined. "That's the thing, Queen. I don't want anything. Because if I did, I would have already done it." His eyes narrowed as he spoke, the intensity of his words heightening the heavy atmosphere in the throne room. The environment seemed transformed. The air became dense, almost palpable, and a silence charged with tension filled the place. The Amazons held their defensive stances, while Diana looked from Clark to her mother, trying to find a way to ease the situation. Hippolyta kept her gaze fixed on Clark, assessing every word and gesture of his. She could sense there was something different about this man, something that set him apart from the others she despised. The anger was still there, but now mixed with an uncomfortable curiosity. After a moment that felt like an eternity, Hippolyta raised her hand, signaling for the guards to lower their swords. "Antiope, Diana, I want you to give us a moment alone," the Queen commanded, her voice firm and authoritative. Antiope immediately frowned, clearly uncomfortable with the order. "My Queen, with all due respect, it's dangerous to leave this man alone with you. I cannot allow it." Hippolyta kept her gaze fixed on Antiope, her expression growing even sterner. "Are you going to disobey your Queen, Antiope?" The Amazon general hesitated, feeling the weight of Hippolyta's authority. After a moment, she lowered her head in respect. "Forgive me, my Queen. It was not my intention to challenge you." She then turned and left the hall, maintaining a firm posture. Diana looked at Clark before leaving, her eyes reflecting a mixture of concern and hope. "I've placed my trust in you, Clark. Prove you're worthy of it." Clark nodded, a slight smile forming on his face. "I won't disappoint you, Princess." Diana turned and left the hall, leaving Clark and Hippolyta alone. The throne room felt even larger and emptier without the other Amazons, the silence echoing off the stone walls and creating a tense atmosphere. Hippolyta remained on her throne, her eyes fixed on Clark, assessing him intensely. After a few moments, she finally broke the silence. "Now we can talk, Clark." Hippolyta remained on her throne, her eyes fixed on Clark, evaluating him intensely. After a few moments, she finally broke the silence. "Now we can talk, Clark." Clark was visibly surprised to hear his name from the Queen's lips. It was the first time Hippolyta called him by his name instead of simply man. This small gesture indicated, in a way, a recognition of his individuality. "You asked to be alone with me, so I think you should be the first to speak," Clark replied, maintaining his calm posture but clearly curious about what would come next. Hippolyta kept her stern gaze, leaning slightly on her throne. "So Clark, tell me, what do you really want?" Clark, sensing the intensity of the question, decided to use his ability to read minds. He closed his eyes for a moment and focused on Hippolyta's thoughts. Her words reflected a mix of anger and curiosity. Clark could feel that the Queen was aware of his extraordinary strength and his interest in Diana. There was genuine fear in Hippolyta that Clark could become a threat to both Themyscira and her daughter. Clark opened his eyes, his expression softening a bit. He knew that the only way to gain Hippolyta's trust was by being honest, however risky it might be. With a slight sigh, he answered, "I want Diana. I like your daughter and want her to be my woman." The throne room fell silent, and Hippolyta's eyes widened slightly, unable to hide her surprise at Clark's bluntness. She hadn't expected such a direct response. However, the surprise was quickly replaced by an expression of irritation. "Power and women. In the end, you're just like all men," Hippolyta said, her tone laden with disdain. Clark couldn't deny Hippolyta's words, but there was more that needed to be said. He decided to speak about the ambitions of the Queen's own daughter. "I understand why you think that, Queen Hippolyta. Many men only think of power and conquest. But Diana wants more than a limited life here on Themyscira. She wants to see the world beyond the island and help others. She told me that. The island is too small for her." Hippolyta narrowed her eyes, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. She knew Clark was right about her daughter's desires, but she was also aware of the consequences if Diana decided to leave the island. You don't understand the implications, man. If Diana leaves Themyscira, she can never return. That's the law that preserves our safety. Clark nodded, respectfully. I know that. But Diana isn't afraid of the consequences. She's willing to sacrifice everything to fulfill her wish to help others. Hippolyta seemed increasingly troubled. The love she had for her daughter was clear in her eyes, but so was her fear of losing her. Clark could see the dilemma on the Queen's face and decided he needed to go a step further to make her understand that perhaps there was another way. Clark took a deep breath before continuing. I know Diana would be banished if she chose to leave the island. That's the consequence of her decision. But what if she had no choice? Hippolyta frowned, clearly confused and irritated by the suggestion. What do you mean by that? Clark chose his words carefully. If someone strong enough like me were to kidnap her and take her off the island, without her consent, Diana could fulfill her wish without suffering the consequences of exile. She could be freed from the responsibility of making that choice herself. Hippolyta stared at him, her expression darkening. She finally understood what Clark was suggesting. You dare to propose such a devious plan? To make it appear as if my daughter was taken by force, so she doesn't suffer the consequences of her actions? Only a man could think of such a thing. A trick, a manipulation, seeking to circumvent our laws and principles. Clark realized he had taken the worst possible approach. He thought the Queen might relent to his idea, but he was completely wrong. Hippolyta rose from her throne, her expression rigid and her gaze filled with determination. You need to understand something, Clark, Hippolyta began, her voice resonating through the throne room. Before being a mother, I am a queen. And my duty is to protect my people, to protect Themyscira from any threat. And you, man, represent a risk I cannot ignore. She continued, doing what is right isn't easy, and being a leader means making sacrifices. Diana is not above the laws of Themyscira, and if she chooses to leave, she knows the consequences. Manipulating the circumstances, as you suggest, not only betrays our principles but also weakens us as a people. Clark remained silent, listening to the Queen's speech. Although he understood her words, he felt frustrated with the situation. He respected Hippolyta's stance, but he still believed there was a way to allow Diana to pursue her own dreams. During Hippolyta's speech, Clark began hearing a distant sound with his super hearing. It was the noise of planes and boats approaching the island. Clark looked toward the window, realizing something was happening. He interrupted Hippolyta, inclining his head slightly in an apologetic gesture. Forgive me, Queen, but it seems I have urgent business to attend to. Tell Diana I'll be right back. Hippolyta stared at him with a suspicious and irritated look, but before she could respond, Clark had already moved at super speed. Whoosh! Clark leaped through the palace window, disappearing in the blink of an eye. Steve Trevor was in a plane, desperately fleeing from the Turkish army. Behind him, Turkish boats and planes pursued, determined to bring him down. Bratata. The Turkish soldiers fired incessantly, their weapons spewing bullets as they tried to hit Steve's plane. He dodged as best he could, but the number of enemies made his escape increasingly difficult. Boom! Steve's plane was hit, and flames began spreading across the wings. He looked at the control panel, his expression showing a mix of fear and determination. Damn. I'm going to need a miracle to get out of this, Steve muttered as he tried to keep control of the burning plane. Vroom. Clark, flying at high speed, spotted the scene of Steve's plane being pursued. He immediately recognized that this was the legendary pilot connected to Diana in another life, and knew he had to act fast. Clark accelerated even more, leaving a trail of air behind him. Whoosh! Clark reached Steve's plane before he lost complete control. Using his super strength, he grabbed the aircraft's fuselage and stabilized it, steering it out of the path of enemy bullets. Steve looked outside the cockpit, his eyes widening in shock and disbelief upon seeing a man literally holding his plane. Who are you? Steve shouted, trying to comprehend what was happening. Clark didn't respond immediately. With a quick motion, he opened the cockpit and pulled Steve out of the plane. Hold tight, I'm getting you out of here, Clark said, his voice calm as he carried Steve above the clouds, ignoring the Turkish boats and planes that continued firing. Steve held onto Clark, his face pale with fear as they rose higher and higher. The air thinned, and the cold wind blew fiercely. What's happening? Who are you? Steve asked, his voice trembling with fright. Clark simply looked into his eyes and in an instant, used his mind-reading ability. He saw flashes of Steve's memories. He had stolen important notes from Dr. Maru and was attempting to deliver them to British intelligence. These notes were crucial to ending the war. Clark took the notes from Steve's bag, his hand steady while the pilot looked on, perplexed. Hey, give those back. I need them to end the war. Steve protested, trying to reach for the notes, but it was futile as he was held in Clark's grip. Clark looked at Steve, his expression becoming cold and determined. Thank you for the information, Steve. But I can't allow you to interfere with my plan. Before Steve could respond or even comprehend what was happening, Clark snapped his neck in one quick, silent movement. Crack. Steve's body went limp, and Clark let him fall, disappearing among the clouds below. He then pocketed Dr. Maru's notes, determined to use them for his own benefit. With Steve out of the way, Clark turned to face the Turkish planes and boats still approaching the island. He knew he couldn't allow them to get close to Themyscira and put the Amazons in danger. Whoosh. Clark took off once again, heading toward the enemies. His expression was serious and determined as he activated his heat vision. Whoosh. The red beams of his heat vision cut through the sky, striking the enemy planes and setting them ablaze. Boats were destroyed as Clark used his strength to bring them down, one by one, without hesitation. Boom. Boom. The explosions echoed across the ocean, and the soldiers stood no chance against Clark's overwhelming power. He felt no remorse as he eliminated each of the enemies. He was determined to protect the island and to assume Steve Trevor's role, both in the war and in Diana's heart. Diana's POV, my mother had asked to be alone with Clark to speak with him. Antiope and I waited outside the throne room. Every second felt like an eternity. I was tense, my heart racing as I wondered what might happen between my mother and that man who had invaded our island, and in some way, my mind over the past few hours. What if he provoked her? What if something got out of control? These thoughts crossed my mind, making me want to go in and interrupt everything. But I knew my mother wouldn't approve. As we waited, Antiope was by my side, her gaze serious and attentive, yet she said nothing. She knew it was not the time to speak, only to watch and be prepared to act if necessary. Then I heard my mother's firm voice calling me. Diana, come in. I entered the throne room quickly. My mother was alone, seated on her throne, her expression as serious as ever. My eyes quickly scanned the room, looking for Clark, but he wasn't there. A deep concern filled me. Mother, what happened to Clark? Did you send him away? Hippolyta looked at me, her expression firm but with a hint of weariness. Clark mentioned he had somewhere to go. He flew out through the window. I felt a tightening in my chest, a mix of relief and worry. Without thinking much, I turned and ran out of the palace. I needed to find him. I needed to know where he was and what he was doing. My mother still had something to say, but she chose to let me go. Perhaps she knew I wouldn't listen, not at that moment. I ran through the palace and down Themyscira stairways until I reached a cliff that offered a broad view of the sea surrounding the island. The wind whipped against my face as I looked toward the horizon. That's when I saw him, Clark, flying above the enemy boats and planes approaching the island. He was destroying them one by one, without hesitation. Boom. Boom. The explosions echoed over the ocean, and the sky was tinged with smoke and flames. I stood there watching, my heart tight as I tried to understand what was happening. Clark was defending the island, but the way he did it was brutal, relentless. All I could think about was Ares and how he must be influencing men. This kind of destruction and brutality didn't seem like something Clark would do out of simple necessity. I knew he was protecting us, but something about the scene made me uneasy. After Clark finished destroying the planes and boats, he came toward me. End of Diana's POV. Clark approached Diana, his expression still carrying traces of the tension he had shown moments before. He looked into her eyes and smiled slightly, trying to ease the heavy atmosphere between them. "Hey, princess. I guess I just showed you a violent side of me," said Clark, his voice a bit softer than Diana expected after all that had happened. Diana remained silent for a moment, observing Clark. She wasn't as concerned with the brutality he had shown. She knew it wasn't personal. She felt there was something greater behind it all, perhaps even the influence of Ares, the god of war. She took a step forward, trying not to seem hesitant. This is Ares's doing. He's influencing men, causing destruction and chaos, Diana said, her voice filled with conviction. You're not responsible for this, Clark. The violence you showed was necessary to protect us. Even without Ares's influence, men and women can be violent, Clark replied, his voice calm. But that doesn't matter now. There's a war going on, and I have to be part of it. Diana noticed the determined look in Clark's eyes, as if he was about to leave. She felt a tightening in her chest, realizing he planned to leave her behind. But that wasn't right. She had trained her whole life to protect the innocent, and she couldn't simply stay while the world was at war. Diana knew this was her fight too. She stepped forward, holding Clark's arm. Wait, she said, her voice firm and determined. I'm going with you. I can't stay here while the world outside is at war. This is my responsibility too. Clark looked at Diana, surprised. He saw the conviction in her eyes and knew she wouldn't change her mind. He nodded slowly, but added a caution. Diana, do you understand what this means? We should speak to your mother and let her know, but as far as I know, if you come with me, you'll be banished. Are you ready for that? Clark asked, his voice filled with concern. Diana took a deep breath, thinking of the consequences. Being banished from Themyscira meant never being able to return home, never seeing her mother or sisters again. But the world needed her, and she couldn't hide while innocents suffered. This was the right decision, even if it was painful. I'm ready, Diana said, her gaze fixed on the horizon. My place is now beside those who need me, beside you if necessary. Clark nodded, respecting her decision. He knew how hard it was for Diana to make this choice, but he also knew there was no other way. Clark looked at Diana with a slight smile and then lifted her into his arms. Diana didn't resist, letting herself be wrapped in Clark's strong arms. In an instant, he took off, carrying her toward the palace. The wind beat against them as Clark flew over the trees and the imposing structures of Themyscira, moving with precision and care. When they reached the palace, Clark chose one of the open windows and with gentleness passed through it, landing with Diana in his arms. He set her down carefully, and Diana took a step forward, preparing to speak with her mother. Hippolyta watched as Diana approached, with Clark standing behind, keeping a respectful distance. Mother, I need to speak with you, Diana began, her voice firm but filled with emotion. I need to leave the island. The world of men is at war, and Ares is behind it. It's my duty to fight him and protect the innocent. Hippolyta narrowed her eyes, shifting her gaze from Diana to Clark. She looked at him with clear distrust and disapproval. So that's it. He's influenced you? This man who invaded our land and planted these ideas in your mind. Clark raised his hand in an apologetic gesture, trying to ease the tension. With all due respect, Queen Hippolyta, I'm not here to divide. Diana made this decision on her own. Hippolyta rose from her throne, her posture rigid and authoritative. Diana, you know what it means to leave Themyscira. If you go, you cannot return. You'll be banished forever. I forbid you from following this path. Our duty is to protect this island, not get involved in men's wars. Diana felt a tightness in her chest, but refused to yield. Mother, I've trained my whole life to protect the innocent. I can't ignore the suffering outside. I can't hide while the world needs me. Hippolyta remained firm, her expression resolute. I will not change my mind, Diana. Themyscira is your home, and your responsibility is to your people. There's no place for you in the world of men. Diana looked at her mother, her eyes teary but unwavering. I love you, Mother. And I love my home. But my duty now is greater than this island. I need to do what's right. Hippolyta was silent for a moment, her expression as hard as stone. Then she looked away, suppressing the pain on her face. If that's your choice, then go. But know that you're leaving everything behind. Hippolyta turned her attention to Clark, her gaze filled with determination. And as for you, man, you're not welcome here. You'll be expelled from the island immediately. Clark didn't seem surprised, but only smiled slightly, almost amused. I understand, Queen Hippolyta. I know my presence here is an affront to many of you. I'm ready to leave. Hippolyta narrowed her eyes. If necessary, we will use all the Amazons to ensure you leave. We're prepared to fight if needed. Clark chuckled softly, shaking his head. With all respect, I could defeat all of you, but that's not why I'm here. I don't want to fight you. I only want to do what's right." He looked at Diana, his smile softening. "And that means taking Diana with me, if she wants to come." Diana approached Clark, holding his hand and looking at her mother one last time. "Goodbye, Mother. I promise I will use everything I've learned here to protect the innocent." Hippolyta did not respond, only turning her face away, avoiding Diana's gaze. Clark then held her firmly, and in the blink of an eye he lifted her, and the two left the palace, flying out through the window. Before leaving the island, Diana turned to Clark, her eyes shining with determination. "Wait, Clark. I need to grab something before we go. It can't be left behind." Clark looked at her with curiosity, nodding as he held her firmly. "All right, but be quick." Diana nodded and pointed toward a tall tower to the north, away from the palace. In one swift movement, Clark flew toward the tower, cutting through the air with speed and precision. They approached the imposing stone structure, its walls covered with ivy and wildflowers. Clark landed gently on the edge of an open window, setting Diana down carefully. She turned to him, her hands still gripping the window ledge. "Don't worry, I won't take long," Diana said, giving him a slight smile before jumping inside the tower, disappearing into the shadows. Clark remained outside the tower, hovering silently as he waited for Diana to return. He looked out over the vast landscape of Themyscira, the island of the Amazons, stretching before his eyes. The dense green forests, vegetation-covered stone peaks, and rivers winding through the island gave the feeling of an untouched and sacred land. The beauty and serenity of the place were undeniable, but there was also an atmosphere of mystery and isolation that made Clark understand what it meant for Diana to leave it all behind. As he observed the island, Clark reflected on what awaited them beyond this place. He knew Diana's choice to leave wasn't easy, and the weight of that decision fell on both of them. The responsibility to protect the world and face the unknown challenges was about to begin. A few minutes later, Diana returned to the window, her eyes bright with determination. She was now dressed in her golden armor, bracers on her arms, and the lasso of truth at her waist. Clark offered a slight smile upon seeing her, admiring her imposing presence. "You look ready to face the entire world," Clark said, his voice filled with admiration. Diana gave a confident smile, her eyes fixed on Clark's. "Maybe that's exactly what I'm about to do." Clark held Diana by the waist, and with a smooth movement, lifted her and took off again. They soared through the air above Themyscira, leaving behind the island and everything it represented. Diana looked back for a moment, her eyes tracing the landscape of her home, knowing it might be the last time she'd see it. "Goodbye, Themyscira," she murmured, closing her eyes for a moment and allowing herself to feel the pain of farewell. Then she looked forward, focusing on the future and what awaited her by Clark's side. Clark flew with Diana in his arms as she looked back, watching the island gradually fade into the horizon. The wind blew fiercely around them, and although Diana appeared determined, there was a silent melancholy she couldn't hide. The place she had always known and the people she loved were being left behind. Yet she knew the mission she was about to embrace was greater than any personal sacrifice. As they flew over the vast ocean, Clark held onto Dr. Maru's notes, information that could change the course of the war. He hesitated to hand them over to the British authorities, knowing they could be used to develop a deadly toxic gas. Clark understood the complexity of the moment, and the weight of the decisions he would need to make bore down on him. It was then that Jor-El's familiar voice manifested in his mind, a serene and inquisitive tone resonating within him. "You seem troubled, Kal-El." Clark furrowed his brow, the words echoing within him as he pondered his situation and his goals. "I don't feel prepared to deal with World War I, much less in a universe where gods walk among mortals," Clark thought, feeling the growing tension within him. Clark knew that his primary objective wasn't merely to intervene in a world conflict. What truly drove him was winning Diana, but to achieve that, he would need to prove himself worthy of fighting by her side. Defeating Ares and ending the war had become a necessity. Jor-El continued, this time with a more direct tone. "Kal-El, any choice you make must come with a sense of responsibility. This world may not be your original world, but every decision you make here will bring valuable lessons. Remember your powers, they can be used wisely to end this conflict effectively without compromising humanity." Clark silently agreed with Jor-El's words. He knew that his mind control and superhuman abilities were enormous assets, which could be used to ensure a positive outcome for this conflict. Diana noticed Clark's thoughtful expression and tried to reassure him. "Don't worry, Clark. I'll defeat Ares, and the war will end." "Thank you for the comforting words, Diana," replied Clark, his voice carrying a hint of irony. Diana frowned, not entirely understanding Clark's tone. "There's no irony here, Clark. We'll stop Ares, and the world will be a better place." Clark let out a brief laugh, clearly finding the situation amusing. "Do you really believe all the world's problems will end with Ares' death?" Diana stared at him, her eyes shining with determination. Ares is the god of war. His influence corrupts men and leads them to destruction. If he is stopped, the war will cease. Clark sighed, shaking his head slightly. "Ares is just a match lighting a fuse filled with gunpowder, Diana. People can be influenced by him, but war is something that also comes from within: greed, fear, desire for power. None of that will disappear just with Ares' death." Diana remained silent for a moment, absorbing Clark's words. Although she could see reason in his words, her conviction that Ares was the root of the conflicts remained firm. "Then we'll do our part and give the world a chance to be better," Diana said, her voice resolute. Clark managed a slight smile. "All right, Princess. Let's give the world a chance." Clark, however, was already tired of trying to explain the complexity of human conflicts to Diana. He decided he would let her discover for herself. Clark arrived in England, carrying Diana in his arms. The atmosphere was oppressive and gray, with the smell of smoke permeating the air. The streets were covered in dust and polluted by the steam from machines and vehicles, filling the space with a constant mechanical hum. The buildings were tall and grim, with their chimneys spewing thick smoke as people hurried by, their faces showing signs of fatigue. It was a scene far removed from the peace of Themyscira, a world entirely different from anything Diana had ever seen. Clark looked at Diana, noticing her expression of astonishment as she took in the surroundings. He smiled slightly, with a hint of irony in his voice. "And what did you expect from the world of men, Diana?" Diana took a deep breath, absorbing the reality before her eyes. The gloomy landscape and the feeling of despair around her didn't discourage her. Instead, they made her feel even more determined. "Maybe it's a dark world, Clark, but I still believe there's hope here. We need to give them a chance to find the light." "If you say so," Clark replied with a slight smile. Clark landed gently on top of a discreet building, out of direct sight from passers-by. The building was worn, its brick walls stained and covered in ivy and moss. From there, they had a wide view of the bustling streets and the gray mist that blanketed the city. The wind blew strong, rustling both of their clothes and Diana's cloak. As soon as they touched down, Clark looked at himself and then at Diana. They were clearly out of place. Diana in her golden Amazonian armor, and Clark in his rustic farm clothes. Anyone looking at them might easily suspect they were more than just ordinary citizens. "We need new clothes, Diana. Like this, we'll draw too much attention." Diana frowned, confused. "Why does our appearance matter, Clark? We're here to fight Ares, not to hide." Clark sighed, trying to explain. "I understand, but here in the world of men, people are easily frightened by what they don't understand. We need to blend in if we want to find where Ares is without raising suspicion. Discretion will be our ally." Diana slowly nodded, still getting used to the differences in the world of men. "All right. If it will help us find Ares, I'll do it." Clark activated the Speed Force. The entire environment around him froze, and Diana appeared in slow motion from Clark's perspective. He knew he needed to act quickly. He left Diana on the rooftop and set off in search of a clothing store. Clark climbed down the emergency stairs of the building and began running through the city streets. With his superhuman speed, he went unnoticed by the citizens moving slowly, as if they were part of a frozen photograph. He found a small clothing store that seemed suitable for what they needed. Clark stopped in front of the store and, without wasting time, entered while the world around him remained frozen thanks to the Speed Force. He knew exactly what needed to be done. First, he looked around, identifying the customers scattered throughout the store. Clark walked up to them, his eyes intensifying as he focused. He hypnotized each of the customers. "You've finished your shopping. Now it's time to go home." Once the Speed Force was deactivated, the customers, now in a trance, would leave the store, following Clark's suggestion without question. With the customers out of the way, Clark turned to the store employees. He knew he had to be careful. Approaching them, he used his hypnosis powers once again. "You will treat me with respect. My name is Mr. Kent, and my wife, Mrs. Kent, is outside. You will provide anything we need without question." Like the customers, the employees would obey Clark's instructions when the Speed Force was deactivated, acting exactly as he commanded. With everything under control, Clark walked through the store, picking out some clothes he deemed suitable for himself and Diana. Before leaving, he also grabbed 2 overcoats. He knew they'd need them to walk around the city without drawing too much attention. Clark quickly returned to the rooftop where Diana awaited him. He landed softly beside her, holding the overcoats. As soon as he deactivated the Speed Force, the world returned to its normal rhythm. "Here, Diana. Put on this overcoat. We'll get some more suitable clothes to blend in here," Clark said, handing her one of the overcoats. Diana looked at the coat that had suddenly appeared in Clark's hands, clearly intrigued. "How did you get this so quickly?" she asked as she put on the coat. Clark just smiled faintly. "Let's just say I'm very efficient when I need to be." Clark and Diana began descending from the building and walking through the streets toward the store. The cold London weather enveloped them, and the bustling crowd kept moving. Diana, wearing the overcoat, seemed curious and observed everything around her, absorbing every detail of this new reality. As they walked, Clark noticed that some people looked at them curiously. It was hard not to notice Diana, even with the overcoat. Her imposing posture and striking features did not go unnoticed, and occasionally someone glanced at them, trying to figure out who these 2 strangers were. Clark maintained a calm demeanor, holding Diana's hand to guide her to the store. He knew they needed to remain discreet, but he was also aware that for someone like Diana, that could be a challenge. Every glance they received was a reminder that they didn't belong there, but it was also motivation to finish their task quickly. When they reached the store, Clark looked at Diana and gave her a reassuring smile. "Let's go inside and get some clothes more appropriate for this place. That way, we might avoid drawing so much attention." Diana nodded, though her eyes were still fixed on the people around them. Clark and Diana entered the store. The employees were all present, while the hypnotized customers had already left. As they entered, one of the employees approached with a warm smile. "Mr. and Mrs. Kent, it's a pleasure to have you here." "How can we help you?" said the employee, speaking with a respectful tone. Clark kept a calm expression. "Thank you. Now, close the store so my wife and I can shop in peace." One of the employees quickly went to the entrance and flipped the open sign to closed with a soft click. She then locked the door, ensuring no one else could enter. Clang. Diana watched everything closely, and the word wife left her slightly confused. Clark was clearly trying to use a cover story, and while she understood that, she couldn't avoid the discomfort of being called his wife. She thought it was likely just a necessary ruse to blend in and avoid suspicion, but still, it felt strange. Clark then looked at Diana and smiled faintly. "Let's pick out some clothes that fit the style of this place better. We need to look more local." Diana nodded, still processing the idea of being called Mrs. Kent, but she didn't question Clark. She knew he had a plan and trusted him. Clark began walking around the store, selecting some clothes. He picked a gray suit for himself, a thick coat, and some neutral-colored shirts. For Diana, he chose a dark blue dress, simple yet elegant, and a long coat that could be useful for London's cold weather. The store employees watched silently, ready to fulfill any requests. Clark approached one of them and asked them to prepare the clothes so he and Diana could try them on. As Diana looked at the clothes Clark had chosen, she couldn't help but admire his effort to adapt to the world of men and the situation they were facing. For her, everything still felt strange, but something about Clark's confidence made her feel that, somehow, they were on the right path. After trying on the clothes, Clark looked at Diana, now dressed in attire more fitting for the locale. She looked like an ordinary woman to others, but to him, it was impossible to ignore the presence and strength she exuded. "You look perfect, Diana," Clark said, a sincere smile on his face. Diana looked at him and returned the smile, adjusting her coat. "Thank you, Clark. You look different, but in a good way." Clark chuckled softly, looking at himself in the mirror. "I think we're ready." Clark approached one of the employees and inquired about lodging in the city. "Could you recommend a good hotel nearby? We need a place to stay for the night." The employee smiled and promptly responded. "Of course, Mr. Kent. I recommend the Savoy Hotel, just a few blocks from here. It's an excellent place, very comfortable." Clark thanked the employee and turned to Diana with a faint smile. "Let's go, Diana. We have another stop to make." Diana nodded, and together they left the store. The employees, still under hypnosis, bid them farewell respectfully. Clark and Diana arrived at the Savoy Hotel, an elegant and imposing building exuding luxury and comfort. They entered the lobby, and Clark approached the reception desk to check in. "Good afternoon. I'd like a room for me and my wife," Clark said, maintaining the cover story. He looked directly into the receptionist's eyes, his gaze intensifying as he focused. "You will treat us with respect. Give us the best available suite and ensure we are not disturbed." The receptionist, now under hypnosis, smiled cordially and retrieved the keys to the hotel's best suite. "Of course, Mr. Kent. I hope you enjoy your stay. Here are the keys to our finest suite, number 305. Clark took the keys and, holding Diana's hand, headed toward the elevator, keeping a composed demeanor as they prepared to enter the room. Diana watched him silently, still processing everything that had happened up to that point. When they reached the third floor, Clark and Diana walked down the corridor to suite 305. Clark unlocked the door and opened it, letting Diana enter first. The suite was spacious and luxurious, with a large, comfortable bed, a magnificent view of London, and elegant decor. Diana looked around, impressed by the surroundings. "This place is so different from anything I've ever seen," Diana said as she walked through the suite, observing every detail. Clark closed the door behind him and smiled, placing the overcoat on a nearby chair. "I hope you can rest a bit here, Diana. We'll need our strength for what's to come." Diana crossed her arms and frowned. "Clark, we can't rest now. Ares is out there, causing destruction. Every minute counts. We need to act immediately." "I know you want to defeat Ares, but we need information and a base to establish ourselves," Clark said, looking around the suite. "Let's take advantage of the room tonight to talk and rest. Ares is a god. We need to be at full strength to defeat him." Diana hesitated, her determination to act immediately still strong. However, Clark's words made sense. She knew that to face a god, they would need to be fully prepared. Diana took a deep breath and slowly nodded. "All right, Clark. I'll trust your judgment. But we can't take too long. Every second counts." Clark smiled softly. "I promise, Diana. Tomorrow, we'll start our search for Ares. But tonight, let's rest." War Council Sir Patrick sat around a large table with generals and high-ranking officers. They were gathered to discuss war strategies, but to the surprise of some, Sir Patrick decided to raise the question of an armistice. "We need to consider an armistice. Continuing to fight at this pace will only bring more destruction and suffering with no end in sight," he declared, his voice firm yet serene. One of the officers, frowning, immediately responded. "Your plan is foolish and reckless, Sir Patrick. Our goal here is to win the war, not negotiate. They've killed too many of our men. We need to wipe them out." Another officer nodded, his face hardened by the toll of battle. "We're here to debate how to win the war, not to talk about an armistice. There's no room for negotiations anymore. We need to push until final victory." While most of the officers vocally opposed him, Sir Patrick remained impassive. His expression showed slight disappointment, as though he had expected more rationality from his colleagues. But inwardly, he was satisfied. He had proposed the armistice knowing it would be rejected. The officers' responses only confirmed what he expected, the burning desire to continue fighting without considering the long-term consequences. It was exactly the reaction he needed. Hotel room Diana looked around the room with curiosity. Despite her urgency to face Ares and end the war, the new environment caught her attention. The elegant decor, the refined details, and the hotel's luxury were entirely different from anything she had ever seen. Clark smiled, noticing the curious expression on Diana's face. He approached her and, with a gentle gesture, pointed to the bathroom. "Come, let me show you something you might like." Diana followed Clark into the bathroom, where he demonstrated how the bathtub worked. The hot water gushed out, creating steam, and Clark showed her how to adjust the temperature. "This is for you to relax a little, Diana. I know we're not used to this kind of comfort, but you deserve it. Diana nodded, still curious, and stepped into the bathroom, closing the door behind her. She allowed herself to relax as she settled into the hot bath. The sensation of the warm water against her skin was incredible, and she closed her eyes, savoring the rare moment of calm. While Diana was in the bathroom, Clark used the time to call room service. He accepted the day's recommendation, hoping the meal would be nutritious and delicious. Clark walked to the window, gazing at London's grey landscape. His thoughts turned to the war, and he frowned as he pondered what lay ahead. Since I'm here in this era, I'll make sure a second world war doesn't happen. At least not for the same reasons. If I kill the right people and hypnotize others, I can end future conflicts. Jor-El's voice manifested in his mind, serene and questioning. That will only happen if you stay in this world and prevent it personally. Even if you kill those you're thinking about, the war will happen one way or another. Clark sighed deeply. Jor-El's words weighed on him, and he knew the artificial intelligence was right. Still, he couldn't help but try. He needed to believe he could make a difference, even if it was small. Soon, room service arrived. Clark opened the door and received the meal, thanking the attendant. The table was set with hot dishes, and a delicious aroma filled the room. Diana, dinner is ready, Clark called, hoping she could enjoy a moment of rest. Diana emerged from the bathroom, dressed in a hotel robe, and approached the table. The dinner was impeccable, and she smiled at Clark in gratitude. They sat down to eat, enjoying the tranquility of the moment. As they ate, Clark noticed how at ease Diana seemed. A thought struck him, and with a mischievous smile he asked, "Diana, what are you wearing under that robe?" Diana looked at him, a bit surprised by the question. "Nothing. I didn't think it was necessary." Clark tried to hide his surprise, but his mind wandered to thoughts he quickly pushed aside. Finally, he cleared his throat and said, "I'll take a bath now, Diana. Feel free to relax." Diana watched Clark as he walked toward the bathroom, noticing the enigmatic smile he wore. She didn't understand the reason for the smile, but couldn't help finding Clark's behavior curious. As he closed the bathroom door, she made herself more comfortable in the chair, trying to figure out what could have been so amusing. After finishing dinner, Clark cleared his throat, his expression becoming serious. "Diana, we need to talk about what I'll do next." Diana frowned, curious. "What do you mean, Clark?" Clark hesitated for a moment, then continued, "I have a suspicion about Ares. I believe he might be disguised among men. There's a man, Sir Patrick, who could be Ares. I need to investigate to be sure." Diana immediately stood up, her expression determined. "I'm a warrior. I must go with you to end this conflict." Clark shook his head, keeping his tone firm. "I only have a suspicion, Diana. I need to confirm it, and where I'm going is no place for a warrior, but for a spy." Diana stared at him, surprised and slightly hurt. She felt as if Clark was excluding her from the war, as though she wasn't part of the fight they were waging together. Clark noticed Diana's expression and sighed. "Don't look at me like that, Diana. I'm serious. It would be problematic to take you with me. But if my suspicions are confirmed, I'll come back to bring you to him. Despite my power, I don't want to face a god alone." Diana narrowed her eyes, her dissatisfaction still evident. "I hope you keep your word. Only the god killer can kill a god." She held up the sword, gripping it firmly. Clark observed the sword and had an idea. "True strength often lies not in the weapon, Diana, but in its wielder. You shouldn't rely solely on the sword, but on your own strength. The sword is powerful, but it's your will, courage, and determination that will give us victory. Trust in yourself, not just the weapon you carry." Diana smiled faintly, inspired by Clark's words. She knew he was right. Her true strength didn't come just from the sword, but from who she was as a warrior. Clark smiled, satisfied with Diana's determination. He wanted that when she discovered she was the true god killer, his face would be the one she remembered. Clark knew that by supporting Diana and helping her believe in herself, he was planting a seed that would blossom at the right time. That's how it should be. Tomorrow, we'll begin the next step. Laboratory Dr. Maru nervously tinkered with vials and test tubes as she worked with chemicals. Her eyes were fixed on the substances before her, but her hands trembled slightly. She was clearly tense, and the reason was obvious. The journal containing notes on the poisonous gas had been stolen, and without it, she was struggling to advance her research. The laboratory door suddenly creaked open. Clang. General Ludendorff entered the room, his piercing gaze scanning the laboratory. "How's the gas production coming along?" he asked bluntly. Dr. Moreau sighed, visibly frustrated. "Without my notes, it's nearly impossible to replicate the formula. I'm trying, but it's terrible without the exact details." General Ludendorff scoffed, impatient. "I don't care about the notes. You did it once. You should be able to do it again." Those curt words lit a spark within Dr. Moreau. Her nervousness began to fade, replaced by a determined expression. She raised her head and with a faint smile said, "Yes, General. I'll do it for you." Dr. Moreau stood up and grabbed a glass vial from a nearby shelf. She approached the general with determination, holding the vial firmly. Without hesitation, she shattered the vial near the general's nose. Crash! The general inhaled the gas escaping from the vial, his face turning pale and uncomfortable. For a moment he staggered, but then, after a minute, he recovered, straightened up, and flashed a sinister smile. "Excellent," he said, a dark gleam in his eyes. Hotel Savoy room the next morning. The London sun was hidden behind the typical city fog, creating a gloomy and tranquil atmosphere at the Savoy Hotel. Clark and Diana were sitting at the table, having breakfast. Clark looked at Diana with an enigmatic smile as she sipped her tea, unaware of what he was about to reveal. "Diana, today I'm going to show you one of my powers that will help us spy and discover who Ares is." Diana looked up at him. "What kind of power, Clark?" Clark smiled slightly before closing his eyes for a moment. Suddenly, his body seemed to disappear before Diana's eyes. She blinked, surprised, trying to understand what had just happened. "Goddess Hera!" exclaimed Diana, standing up from her chair, her eyes wide as she looked around for Clark. Concern crossed her face as she looked at the empty space where he had been moments before. Clark, still invisible, walked over to her and gently touched her shoulder. "Calm down, Diana," he said as he slowly reappeared, a reassuring smile on his face. "I just became invisible. This power will help us infiltrate and discover what we need without being detected." Diana sighed in relief, though her expression still showed some apprehension. "Incredible, Clark. But you could have warned me before disappearing like that," she said, crossing her arms. Clark smiled apologetically. "Sorry, I didn't mean to scare you. But now you know what I'm capable of. This power can make a difference in our search for Ares." Diana nodded, still processing what she had just witnessed. Though she was surprised, she also felt more confident. Clark had abilities that could help them overcome Ares. "All right, Clark. Let's use this power wisely." After breakfast, Clark prepared to leave on his mission. He knew that the next step was crucial. He looked at Diana, who was standing near the window, gazing at the city view. "Diana, I'm going to become invisible and search for Ares. I want you to stay here until I return with information. I promise I won't take long." Diana frowned, clearly displeased with the idea of being stuck in the room doing nothing. "I'll wait for you, Clark, but come back soon with news. The faster we return, the faster we can eliminate Ares and bring peace," she said, determination in her voice. Clark discreetly rolled his eyes, invisible to Diana, who couldn't see his reaction. "Yes, Diana. And then you can rest in a grateful land," he replied with a slightly ironic, yet still reassuring tone. Diana seemed satisfied with the response, letting out a sigh and relaxing a little more. She knew Clark had a plan, and as difficult as it was to stay on the sidelines, she trusted him. Clark, now invisible, left the room, leaving Diana with her thoughts. She looked out at the city once more, reflecting on what was to come. Laboratory. Dr. Moreau's POV. I'm in my laboratory, my eyes burning with exhaustion as I stare at the test tubes before me. Deep dark circles decorate my face, but despite that, a feeling of satisfaction fills me. The pride in my work surpasses any physical discomfort. Even after losing the notes, I managed to recreate the poisonous gas, a feat many would consider impossible, but not me. I am Dr. Moreau, and there is no obstacle I cannot overcome. Holding the vial containing the gas, my heart races. I feel a wave of pride swelling inside me. The greenish glow of the substance seems even more vibrant under the laboratory light. My lips curl into a smile as I gently shake the vial. General Ludendorff will be pleased with this, I murmur to myself, feeling the weight of responsibility transform into a comforting certainty. This formula will change the course of the war, and it's thanks to me. Euphoria takes hold of me, and I can't help but let out a small laugh. I did it. I recovered what seemed lost. And now, nothing can stop me. London streets. Clark's POV. I walked through the streets of London, invisible and intangible, my presence imperceptible to everyone around me. The thick fog covered the city, and the muffled sound of footsteps echoed through the alleys. I moved with agility, using my intangibility to pass through walls and enter restricted areas. My mind was focused on one goal: finding Ares. I started reading the minds of the soldiers I came across. Each thought, each memory, brought clues that I hoped would lead me to the target. I searched their minds for useful information, going through low-ranking soldiers on the streets, trying to gather any relevant detail. After some time, I found a promising lead. I was reading the mind of a soldier who mentioned a colonel involved in secret meetings about military strategies. The colonel's name was Alfred Whitaker, a man who seemed to be closer to the secrets I was trying to uncover. I followed the information, and soon I was in front of Colonel Whitaker's residence. Using my intangibility, I entered undetected. The house was silent, and the colonel's breathing from an upstairs room was the only sound that stood out in the tranquil environment. I climbed the stairs slowly, heading towards the colonel's bedroom. Upon entering, I found him sleeping soundly. I approached and touched his head, focusing on his memories. Images of meetings, strategies, and finally, what I needed, Sir Patrick's address. Well, now I just need to go to this castle and confirm Sir Patrick's identity. If he really is Ares, I'll come back and talk to Diana. With the information in mind, I left the residence as discreetly as I had entered. It was time to move on to the next step, and with every passing moment, I felt we were getting closer to the final confrontation. Dr. Moreau's laboratory. Dr. Moreau was anxious, awaiting General Ludendorff's arrival. She moved restlessly around the laboratory, her eyes watching the test tubes and vials that were neatly aligned on the table. The tension was evident in her expression, but there was also a glimmer of anticipation. Finally, the laboratory door opened abruptly. Clang! The sound of the door reverberated through the quiet room, and General Ludendorff entered with firm steps. His imposing figure contrasted with the delicacy of the scientific equipment around. His eyes fixed on Dr. Moreau, who quickly turned to him with a determined smile. "General, look what I have for you," Dr. Moreau announced, her eyes gleaming with pride as she carefully picked up a vial containing the poisonous gas. Dr. Moreau walked over to Ludendorff, her hands holding the vial with the utmost caution, as if she were holding the key to victory. She handed the vial to him, her eyes fixed on the general's face, searching for a reaction. Ludendorff took the vial, examining it closely. His expression was a mixture of approval and expectation. He looked at Dr. Moreau and opened a satisfied smile. "I told you you'd manage." Dr. Moreau nodded, her eyes still fixed on the vial. There was exhaustion in her posture. Her dark circles were deep, a result of a sleepless night, but the pride was evident. The feeling of having contributed to something grand surpassed any fatigue. "I stayed up all night, but it was worth it," she said, her voice filled with determination. She knew this moment was crucial, and her work had not been in vain. Ludendorff held the vial firmly, his eyes fixed on Dr. Moreau. He took a step back, still observing the green liquid, his mind already projecting the next steps in the military campaign. With this, victory in the war is guaranteed. Dr. Moreau smiled at the confidence in Ludendorff's voice, but she wasn't satisfied with words alone. She knew it was necessary to prove the gas's effectiveness in practice. With a gesture of her hand, she indicated a side door leading to an adjacent room. "General, I've prepared a quality test for you to see the power of the gas in action. We have a prisoner of war whom we'll use as a test subject." Ludendorff raised an eyebrow, intrigued. He followed Dr. Moreau into the adjacent room. Through a large glass window, they could see a prisoner tied to a chair in the center of the room. The man was clearly terrified, his eyes wide as he looked around, trying to understand what was happening. Dr. Moreau approached a control panel beside the window and adjusted a few levers. "We're going to release the gas now, General. Watch closely." Ludendorff crossed his arms, his eyes fixed on the prisoner. Dr. Moreau pressed a button, and a hissing sound began to be heard as the green gas started to fill the room. The prisoner immediately began coughing, his eyes watering as he tried in vain to break free from the restraints. The coughing quickly turned into screams of agony. The gas seemed to penetrate his lungs, causing unbearable pain. His muscles contracted involuntarily, and he writhed in the chair, trying to escape from something inescapable. Aha! The sound of screams echoed through the room, muffled only by the glass that separated the laboratory from the testing area. Ludendorff watched it all with an impassive expression, his eyes narrowing slightly as the prisoner succumbed to the effects of the gas. Within minutes, the man's body went still, his face twisted in a permanent expression of pain. Dr. Moreau, without any sign of remorse, turned off the gas flow and looked at Ludendorff. "Well done, Dr. Moreau," said Ludendorff, his tone cold but satisfied. "This is the kind of weapon we need to secure our supremacy. You did an excellent job, and your dedication will not go unnoticed." Dr. Moreau bowed her head slightly, the pride still evident in her eyes. "Thank you, General. I'm ready to produce more when needed. This is just the beginning." Ludendorff nodded, still watching the lifeless body through the glass. "Prepare yourself, Dr. Moreau. We have a lot of work ahead, and we cannot fail." Dr. Moreau smiled, determined. "We won't fail, General. With this gas, the world will see our power." Clark at Sir Patrick's castle. "So, that's the castle." Clark observed from a distance, still invisible, leaning against a nearby tree. Sir Patrick's castle stood out on the horizon, a stark stone structure surrounded by a dense forest of ancient trees. The architecture was imposing but lacked excessive ornamentation, a typical fortress of old London, with towers reaching toward the cloudy sky. There were no other visible buildings, only the castle and the surrounding trees, creating an isolated and almost mystical environment. Clark narrowed his eyes, activating his X-ray vision. The castle's thick walls did little to block his power, allowing him to scan the various rooms. He located Sir Patrick in the main hall, seated in a rustic armchair, seemingly lost in thought. His posture was relaxed, with no indication of urgent or suspicious activity. "There he is." Clark pondered, realizing that simply observing from afar would not be enough to confirm his suspicions. Sir Patrick's apparent calm did not reveal the true identity of the man Clark believed to be Ares. "If I want to confirm he's Ares, I'll have to get closer." Clark was about to act when his super hearing picked up something alarming from the city. Desperate screams of a woman echoed in the distance. "Murderer! Murderer! Help!" He remained invisible, leaning against the tree, as his attention shifted to the chaos unfolding in London's streets. The screams grew louder, suggesting a critical situation that could not be ignored. Hotel Savoy. A few minutes earlier, Diana in the hotel room time seemed to crawl painfully in the hotel room. Diana was restless, feeling trapped and useless. She paced back and forth, casting impatient glances at the window, trying to see beyond the thick fog covering London. The passivity imposed by the weight felt like a weight on her shoulders. She needed action. She needed to do something. The feeling of helplessness was something the warrior simply could not bear. Suddenly, Diana stopped, her sharp senses picking up something unusual. Screams. Not just one scream but several, coming from the same floor of the hotel. Desperate voices echoed through the hallways, and she could clearly distinguish a woman crying out for help. "Help! Someone help me!" Diana frowned, her warrior instincts instantly kicking in. Without hesitation, she walked to the corner of the room and grabbed her gear, her sword, shield, and the lasso of truth. Her expression was one of pure determination. There was no way she would stand idle while someone was in danger so close by. With her weapons in hand, Diana opened the door to the room and quickly stepped into the hallway. She could hear the screams coming from one of the nearby rooms, her heartbeat pulsing in sync with the urgency of the situation. Determined, she ran toward the sound, her armor reflecting the pale light illuminating the hotel corridor. When she reached the door where the screams were coming from, Diana didn't hesitate. She threw her weight against the door, which gave way with a deafening crash. Bam! The door burst open violently, slamming against the wall with a force that made the room tremble. Diana quickly entered, her eyes immediately capturing the scene before her. A woman was naked, tied to the bed, her eyes wide with terror. Above her, a man was kneeling, turning with an expression of absolute shock as he saw Diana's imposing figure in her armor. "What do you think you're doing?" Diana roared, her voice firm and powerful, echoing through the room. The man, paralyzed by the sudden entrance, hesitated, unable to articulate an immediate response. The woman on the bed, seeing Diana, became even more frightened. Her eyes widened in terror as if the warrior's presence was equally threatening. She didn't know who this armed and powerful figure was. She only saw someone who had just broken down the door. Finally, the man recovered from the shock, his expression shifting from fear to anger as he shouted, "Who do you think you are? How dare you barge into this room?" Diana didn't respond with words. In a swift, precise movement, she raised her sword and, with a decisive strike, decapitated the man in one blow. Slash. The man's body fell to the floor as his head rolled to the side, leaving a trail of blood on the floor. Diana turned her attention to the woman, her voice attempting to be reassuring, though the scene was still saturated with violence. "You're safe now. There's no need to worry," Diana said, trying to calm the woman. However, the woman's reaction was one of pure panic. She began writhing in her restraints, her eyes fixed on Diana's figure, tears streaming down her face. "Murderer! Murderer! Help!" the woman screamed, her body trembling with fear as she tried to get as far away from the warrior as possible. Diana frowned, confused by the woman's reaction. She had just saved her life, but instead of gratitude, the victim was terrified. "You don't need to be scared. I've already killed that man," Diana said, trying to explain, but her voice sounded almost perplexed, as if she couldn't understand why the woman was so frightened. The woman, however, could not be comforted. She continued to scream, her voice hoarse with desperation. "Help. Someone help me. Murderer." Her eyes were wide with terror, unable to process that Diana was a savior. To her, all that mattered was that she had witnessed a brutal and bloody scene. She shrank against the headboard of the bed, still tied up, her body shaking uncontrollably. Diana, unsure of what to do, stood by her side, trying to find a way to calm the woman but realizing that, at that moment, her presence only amplified the victim's terror. Suddenly, everything around seemed to stop. The woman, who had been writhing in despair, suddenly froze. Her terrified expression remained, but her body was motionless, the trembling halting abruptly. Diana, still holding her blood-stained sword, stood frozen, a crimson drop suspended mid-air. It was as if time had been suspended at that moment. At that moment, Clark entered the room, the Speed Force still active. The scene before his eyes was chaotic and tragic. He saw the man's decapitated body on the floor, the head nearby, and the woman tied to the bed, screaming in despair. Diana stood there, her bloodied sword in hand, a look of perplexity frozen on her face. I shouldn't have left Diana alone, Clark thought, his mind quickly assessing the scene and considering the next steps. Clark approached the woman carefully. He touched her head and began to read her mind, accessing her memories. The images flowed into his consciousness. The woman was a prostitute hired to enact a consensual role-play scenario with a now-dead man. The scene Diana had interrupted was consensual, and the man posed no real threat. Clark turned his attention to Diana, who remained frozen. She was clearly confused, unaware of the context in which she had acted. How am I going to clean up this mess? Clark thought, observing the complexity of the situation. The blood on the floor, the panicked woman, and Diana, the warrior who, unknowingly, had made a fatal mistake. It all required a careful and swift solution to prevent the situation from escalating further. Clark had a cunning idea. He turned his attention back to the woman, touching her head once more. This should work, he thought as he began altering her memories. The woman would still fear Diana due to the brutality of the situation, but she would remember her as someone who saved her. Clark, on the other hand, would be seen as a figure of trust and comfort. Once he finished modifying her memories, Clark stepped into the hallway and deactivated the Speed Force. As time returned to normal, Clark entered the room, his face showing genuine concern. "Diana, what are you doing? You were supposed to wait for me in the room." "Who is this dead man?" he asked, his voice filled with urgency. Diana looked at Clark, ignoring the corpse on the floor and focusing on the tied-up woman. Concern filled her gaze, but not for the man, whose fate she deemed irrelevant. "I heard screams and thought she was in danger. I couldn't just stand by." The woman, still gasping and clearly traumatized, looked at Diana and then at Clark. Fear filled her eyes, but there was also a spark of recognition. "Thank you for saving me, but..." Her voice faltered for a moment before continuing, "I'd prefer to speak with him alone." She indicated Clark with a slight nod, clearly uncomfortable in Diana's presence. Clark nodded, understanding the delicacy of the situation. He turned to Diana, keeping a serious tone. "Diana, go to the bathroom and clean your sword. I'll take care of this. Don't come out until I call you. We need to maintain discretion. Any rash actions could alert Ares and compromise him." Diana hesitated, her eyes fixed on the woman for a moment, before finally nodding. Without another word, she headed to the bathroom, taking her sword with her. The door closed with a metallic clang. Clang. With Diana out of the room, Clark approached the woman, trying to reassure her. "It's all right now. I'll make sure you're safe and that nothing else happens. I deeply regret what you went through." The woman still trembled, but Clark's words, coupled with his hypnotic influence, began to take effect. She slowly nodded, her tears finally ceasing. Clark knew he had to resolve this meticulously, leaving no trace that could be traced back to them. Clark reactivated the Speed Force. Everything around froze, as if time itself had been suspended at that critical moment. Clark knew he needed to act swiftly to resolve all aspects of this situation. First, he cleaned the signs of violence from the room, removing all traces of blood and any evidence of the confrontation. With his super speed, he ensured no evidence remained. Then, he turned his attention to the man's corpse. Without hesitation, he grabbed the body and, using his intangibility, passed through the walls of the room and exited the hotel. Moving quickly through the city streets, he reached a nearby river and disposed of the body, ensuring no one would find it. After dealing with the corpse, Clark returned to the hotel. As he passed through the hallways, he noticed some guests had come out of their rooms, drawn by the noise and commotion. Without wasting time, he touched the heads of each one, altering their memories so they would forget any suspicious sounds or events that had led them out of their rooms. This ensured there would be no witnesses. Clark returned to the room he shared with Diana. He retrieved the overcoat he had left there, knowing it would be necessary to ensure Diana's discreet departure from the hotel. Then, he returned to the room where the woman was still tied up. With a quick movement, Clark untied the woman, allowing her to sit on the bed more comfortably. After ensuring everything was in order, he deactivated the Speed Force, returning time to its normal flow. "You can get dressed and leave," Clark said. His voice was calm but firm, indicating that everything was under control. The woman looked at him, still visibly shaken but now with growing trust. She slowly nodded, beginning to put on her clothes, which were on a nearby shelf, as she prepared to leave. Clark then walked to the bathroom door and knocked lightly. "Talk. Talk. Diana, you can come out now. Everything is under control." Diana stepped out of the bathroom, her sword now cleaned and sheathed. She looked at Clark, trying to understand if the situation had truly been resolved. Clark watched as the woman prepared to leave and picked up the overcoat, handing it to Diana. "Put on the overcoat, Diana. We're leaving this hotel now." Clark's voice was low but carried an urgency that allowed no objections. Diana observed the woman walking away, her gaze still carrying traces of fear but also relief. Diana took the overcoat and put it on, the heavy fabric covering her armor and concealing her distinctive presence. Clark watched her for a moment, assessing her expression. There was understanding and determination in Diana's eyes. Together, they left the hotel room, prepared for the next step in their mission. The dense fog of London lingered over the streets as Clark and Diana walked in silence. The city was shrouded in a damp darkness, punctuated only by the faint glow of streetlights and the occasional movement of people crossing the night. Finally, Diana broke the silence. "Clark, did I jeopardize the plan by intervening like that?" She looked directly at him, her expression firm. "I don't regret helping that woman. If I had to do it again, I would, without hesitation." Clark turned his head toward her, considering her words before responding. "You acted according to your principles, Diana, and that's something I admire. But we need to be more strategic moving forward. Every action, no matter how justified, can have unforeseen repercussions, especially when dealing with Ares." Clark paused, observing Diana's expression, which reflected a mix of understanding and resistance. "We are in a territory where morality isn't as clear as open-field combat. We need to balance strength with subtlety." Diana took a deep breath, absorbing Clark's words. "I understand, Clark. But I can't ignore someone in danger." If it means complicating our plan, so be it. I can't be a bystander to suffering. Clark nodded, a faint smile forming on his lips. I wouldn't expect anything less from you, Diana. It's precisely your moral strength that makes you an unparalleled warrior. But remember, our mission here is bigger than each of these isolated battles. We need to defeat Ares to prevent suffering on a much larger scale. Diana looked at the fog-blanketed city, her eyes reflecting a renewed determination. Then let's find him. Together, we'll end his destructive influence. Clark took a step forward, his expression serious. Diana, Ares is a powerful god, and his death will trigger immense repercussions. Once we kill him, we'll have to leave this world for some time. There won't be a place for us here for several decades. That's why I plan to take you to my world. He looked at her deeply, seeking her understanding. Diana didn't hesitate. Her eyes shone with determination. I'm willing to pay that price, Clark. It doesn't matter where we are, as long as we fight together. Clark extended his hand, and Diana gripped it firmly. They walked down the street toward the unknown, aware of the challenges that still awaited them but with unwavering confidence in each other. As they continued toward Sir Patrick's castle, Clark began to hear the familiar voice in his mind. Kal-El, the battle against Ares will not be like any other you've faced. He is ruthless, and you'll need to be equally brutal to avoid being killed. Do not hesitate to use all the power you possess. Clark kept his expression neutral, but paid close attention to Jor-El's words. Furthermore, I suggest you share more information about your true nature with Diana. Your ability to create a mental bond could be valuable for quickly transmitting information during battle. She needs to know who you truly are, the last Kryptonian, and understand the need to perpetuate your species. Kal-El, it will be essential to have more than one partner if we are to ensure the survival of the Kryptonian lineage. Clark nearly laughed at the last part. Internally, he thanked Jor-El for validating, albeit pragmatically, his plan to establish a harem. This way, his strategy of forming multiple bonds could proceed more naturally, or at least as naturally as possible. Thanks, Jor-El, Clark thought, a hint of sarcasm in his thoughts, though there was some relief in the idea that his intentions could be justified by a biological necessity. Clark tightened his grip on Diana's hand. Prepare yourself, Diana. We're almost at his castle, and the fight could cost us our lives. Diana merely nodded, her eyes fixed on Clark. There was no fear in her gaze, only serene resolve. She knew what was at stake and was willing to face any challenge alongside Clark. Her body moved with the grace of an experienced warrior, her muscles tense beneath her armor, reflecting her readiness. They finally saw Sir Patrick's castle, its dark towers emerging from the mist like an imposing silhouette. Clark felt the tension rise as they approached, but also a sense of purpose. Ares was there, and together, they would confront him. Clark and Diana walked toward Sir Patrick's castle, the dense London air shrouded in fog and mystery. As they advanced, Clark decided to reveal one of his abilities to Diana, knowing it would be crucial in the upcoming confrontation. Diana, there's something I need to tell you before we move forward. I have the ability to speak directly into your mind, and you'll be able to do the same with me. It will be essential for us to communicate during the battle without our enemies learning our plans. Diana looked at him, surprised, then tried this new form of communication without moving her lips. That's incredible, Clark. You should have told me earlier. Clark gave a faint smile as he heard her words in his thoughts. A lot has happened, Diana, and I forgot to mention it. Diana nodded, absorbing this newfound ability, feeling more prepared for what lay ahead. As they drew closer to the castle, Clark decided to share his plan of action with Diana. He knew she needed to be aware of every detail, given the risks involved. Diana, the plan is straightforward. I'll storm the castle head-on, and you'll follow shortly after. The idea is for me to be the primary distraction, allowing you to make your move without being immediately detected. Diana frowned at the plan, raising the God-Killer sword, its threatening gleam reflecting in the dim light. Clark, only the God-Killer can slay Ares. This sword is the only thing that can defeat him. Clark nodded, understanding the importance of what Diana was saying. I know. My role is just to distract Ares as much as possible. Once I've drawn his full attention, that's when you'll deliver the final blow. Once that's done, we need to leave London quickly. We have other places to go, and we can't afford to stay here after the fight. Diana nodded again, her expression unwavering. When they were close enough to the castle, Clark stopped and activated his X-ray vision. His pupils glowed faintly as he scanned the thick stone walls, locating Ares in the main hall. The god was relaxed, sitting in an ornate armchair, seemingly unaware of what was about to occur. Clark turned to Diana and communicated mentally. "He's in the main hall. I'll start the attack. Wait for the right moment to act." Diana, using their mental connection, replied, "Understood. Good luck, Clark." Leaving Diana on the ground, he took flight, soaring high into London's cloudy skies. Diana stayed below, her eyes fixed on Clark's ascending figure, her heart pounding with anticipation. At the highest point, Clark paused momentarily, taking a deep breath before diving in freefall. He plummeted like a meteor, tearing through the sky at a dizzying speed, the sound of atmospheric pressure building around him. Push. Inside the castle, Ares sat in the main hall, enjoying a goblet of wine. He smirked cynically as the calm atmosphere remained undisturbed. Suddenly, his heightened senses kicked in, and he raised his eyes toward the ceiling. "What's that noise?" Before he could react, the ceiling collapsed, and Clark crashed through the rubble with a powerful kick directly to Ares's face. Thud. Ares was thrown backward, colliding with the wall and creating a crater upon impact. His goblet fell to the ground, the wine spilling deep red across the debris. Outside, Diana observed the devastating impact. The castle trembled, its walls quaked, and towers began to crumble under Clark's destructive force. Stones fell, and a dense cloud of dust and debris rose, partially obscuring the view. The sound of collapsing walls echoed through the landscape, and Diana knew it was time to act. She gripped the sword hilt tightly, feeling the mission's pulse in her hands. Without hesitation, she charged toward the castle, determined to end Ares's threat and bring the peace they sought. Inside the castle, Ares slowly rose from the crater in the wall, his face contorted in pure fury. His breathing was heavy, and his eyes, once cynically calm, now burned with intense rage. He looked around, trying to locate the attacker. "Who dares challenge me?" Ares roared, his gaze sweeping the destroyed hall. But Clark had already turned invisible, moving stealthily through the rubble. Unable to see his assailant, Ares clenched his fists, the air around him rippling with the energy emanating from his body. His frustration grew with each passing second, transforming into an unbearable thirst for vengeance. At that moment, Clark communicated mentally with Diana. "Diana, I'm invisible now. I'll restrain him and create an opening for you to strike." Diana, already inside the castle, moved through the destroyed corridors, responding mentally. "Understood. As soon as you have him, I'll strike." Clark positioned himself, observing Ares with precision. He waited for the right moment as the god of war still searched in vain for his attacker. When Ares turned his back, Clark seized the opportunity. With a quick and precise move, he grabbed Ares by the shoulders, holding him tightly. Ares reacted instantly, his body tensing as he tried to break free. He roared in rage, his muscles contracting, and energy radiating intensely from his body. He thrashed violently, trying to escape Clark's grip, who remained invisible, firmly holding on as Ares's arms flailed desperately. "You think you can stop me, worm?" Ares bellowed, his voice reverberating through the destroyed hall. He leaned forward, flexing his muscles as he gathered his strength to break free. His face twisted in pure hatred, veins bulging as he used all his might. Despite the god of war's struggle, Clark resisted, focused on keeping Ares restrained. "Now, Diana," Clark thought, sending the mental message. Diana, already prepared, advanced, her figure emerging from the shadows. Ares, noticing her presence, widened his eyes, aware of the imminent danger. He barely had time to react before Diana leaped over the rubble, the sword raised in her hands. In a fluid and precise motion, Diana brought the sword down on Ares, aiming for his vital point. The blade glowed intensely, as if channeling all its divine energy into the strike. At the last moment, Ares used his telepathic powers. A wave of psychic energy emanated from his mind, hitting Diana and throwing her back. She was violently hurled against the castle wall, her body colliding with the rubble. Crash. "Ah!" Diana cried out in pain, her body writhing from the impact. Ares, seizing the opportunity, concentrated his energy and unleashed powerful lightning bolts over his body, enveloping himself in a protective layer of pure electricity. Zot sap. The lightning bolts spread through the hall, striking Clark, who still held Ares. The electric discharge was intense, coursing through Clark's body, forcing him to release Ares and making him visible again. Oh! Clark screamed, his body convulsing under the intense shock, his muscles contracting involuntarily from the electricity coursing through him. Thud. Clark fell to the ground, gasping, his senses still reeling from the attack. He looked at Ares, who now stood with a triumphant expression, his body encased in pulsing electricity. Damn, the plan failed, Clark muttered, trying to regain his balance as he got up. Ares, now free, stood tall with a triumphant expression, his eyes still radiating threatening energy. He looked at Diana, struggling to get up, then at Clark, attempting to recover. The battle was far from over, and Ares was more determined than ever to annihilate his opponents. Diana, despite the pain, managed to stand, her gaze fixed on Ares. She knew they needed to unite once more to have any chance against him. Clark, still fighting the pain pulsing through his muscles, turned his attention to Diana, finding the same determination in her eyes as before. The battle was just beginning, and they both knew they would need all the strength and strategy they possessed to defeat a god. Diana, despite her pain, managed to stand, her gaze fixed on Ares. She knew they would need to unite once more to have any chance of defeating him. Clark, still grappling with the throbbing pain in his muscles, turned his attention to Diana, finding in her eyes the same unwavering determination. Observing Diana, Ares finally recognized her. A cynical smile formed on his lips as he stared at her. The daughter of Zeus. Ares said, his voice dripping with disdain. I see you finally decided to face your destiny. Diana narrowed her eyes, her expression reflecting contempt. I am not the daughter of Zeus, she declared firmly, her voice sharp. I am the daughter of Hippolyta, molded from clay by her hands. My mother gave me life, not Zeus. Ares laughed, a dark sound laden with irony. Oh, you still cling to those childish tales, Diana. The truth stands before you, and denying your lineage won't change who you are. You are the daughter of Zeus, a demigoddess. Your father's power flows through your veins, whether you accept it or not. Diana raised her sword once more, her eyes locked onto Ares. However, Ares remained unfazed. He looked at the gleaming blade of the sword and smirked. There wasn't a trace of fear in his gaze. Instead, he exuded an almost disdainful confidence, as if the situation were mere entertainment. Do you truly believe this sword can destroy me? Ares mocked, raising an eyebrow. Without hesitation, Diana advanced, her mind focused on the imminent attack. But before she could get close, Ares abruptly raised his hand, and the sword was torn from her grasp by an invisible force. The blade hovered in the air, as if possessing its own will, suspended by Ares's telekinetic power. Diana stared in disbelief, her eyes widening for a moment before narrowing in pure anger. No. That sword, it's the God Killer. It's the only thing that can destroy you. Diana shouted, advancing again with unwavering conviction. Ares let out a deep laugh, echoing through the ruined halls. His eyes gleamed with a mix of cruelty and absolute certainty. God Killer? Do you truly believe that, Diana? That a weapon forged by mortals could contain the power of a god like me? He shook his head, still laughing. No, Diana. The true God Killer isn't the sword. It never was. He pointed at Diana, his expression turning serious and penetrating. The true God Killer is you, Diana. You are the weapon destined to kill gods. Not a sword, not an artifact, but your very essence. That's why you were created. You were made to destroy me. With a disdainful look, Ares extended his hand toward the sword, which floated between him and Diana. The blade began to vibrate, the metal crackling with a dark energy emanating from the god. Slowly, the sword started to melt, its form dissolving into a gleaming liquid that dripped through the invisible fingers of Ares's telekinesis. Diana watched, her eyes wide as the blade she had always believed to be her only chance disintegrated before her. Stop with the lies, Ares. Diana shouted, her voice filled with frustration and disbelief. But it was too late. The sword was completely destroyed, her hopes crumbling along with the weapon she had always thought was the key to defeating the god. Ares cast a cold glance at Diana, a triumphant smile etched on his lips. See, Diana, the truth you refuse to accept. The weapon wasn't the sword, it was you. Face it. Face who you truly are. Clark, who had been observing Ares' distraction and Diana's expression of disbelief, saw the perfect opportunity. With fierce determination, he charged toward Ares, flying at astonishing speed. Before the god could react, Clark delivered a devastating punch that drove Ares into a deep crater, sending stones and debris flying in all directions. Thud. Ares was hurled to the ground, his body colliding violently as the force of the blow reverberated through the castle, shaking its structures. Clark wasted no time. He flew to Diana, landing beside her, his eyes still fixed on the crater where Ares lay. Diana, it doesn't matter who or what the god killer is. That doesn't change what we came here to do. You have the power, and together we can end him. Diana looked at Clark, uncertainty still visible on her face, but found a glimmer of hope in his voice. She took a deep breath, closing her eyes for a moment before opening them again, now filled with renewed determination. You're right, Clark. The weapon is irrelevant. It's what we do with our power that truly matters. From the depths of the crater, a metallic sound reverberated. Ares emerged, his figure now enveloped by a new aura of power. The god of war rose slowly, his eyes fixed on Clark and Diana. He raised a hand, brushing the dust from his armor as a crooked smile appeared on his face. I must admit, that was a good hit for a mortal, Ares spoke, his voice laced with a mix of sarcasm and admiration. And your speech, inspiring. But tell me, do you really believe you can defeat a god? Only a god can kill another god. As he spoke, the energy around Ares began to intensify, and an armor forged of pure dark energy started to materialize on his body, covering him from head to toe. The plates of the armor were imposing and menacing, glowing with a light that seemed to emanate from the depths of his divine essence. Clark watched as Ares armed himself, his eyes narrowing. He took a step forward, maintaining his firm posture. I only believe in one god, and I'm sure he doesn't dress like that. Ares let out another laugh, filled with disdain. Ah, of course, the faith of humans. Always so pathetic. Do you truly believe that a benevolent, invisible, incorporeal entity would intervene to save creatures as weak as you? Clark didn't react. His expression remained serene, unshakable. Ares's words were absorbed like wind passing through him, meeting no resistance. Clark knew in whom he believed, and nothing Ares said could shake his conviction. Clark then communicated through the mental link with Diana. Diana, I'll go ahead and distract Ares. Trust me and be ready to use your bracelets. We need the right moment. Diana nodded discreetly, her eyes steady as she watched Ares. Understood, Clark. I won't fail. Clark advanced swiftly, charging at Ares with all his might. Ares tried to defend himself, but Clark's speed and strength were overwhelming. Each blow Clark delivered made the ground tremble, and Ares's body was tossed around like a mere rag doll. Bam! Bam! Thud! Ares attempted to retaliate, but Clark's fists struck with such rapidity that he barely had time to react. Ares, the self-proclaimed god of war, was being humiliated in physical combat. Clark gave him no respite. God of war? What a joke, mocked Clark, a disdainful smile forming on his lips as he struck Ares again, driving him further into the ground. Frustrated and enraged, Ares gathered all his energy and used his telekinesis to push Clark away. An invisible force hit Clark squarely, hurling him into a stone wall, which crumbled upon impact. Whoosh! Clark quickly got to his feet, positioning himself in front of Diana to protect her. Ares rose once more, his expression overflowing with hatred. I will destroy you, worthless mortal. With a furious expression, Ares raised his arms, invoking the elements around him. The skies above the castle began to churn, and lightning descended in a torrential flow, converging toward the god's body. The bolts enveloped Ares, being absorbed and transformed into an electric aura that covered his armor. Whoosh! Splash! Diana watched the scene from behind Clark, understanding that they would need to combine all their strengths and abilities to overcome Ares's growing power. Prepare yourself, Diana, it's now, thought Clark, sending the mental message. Overflowing with power, Ares raised his hands and unleashed a torrent of lightning directly at Clark. The bolts sliced through the air with devastating force. Clark, however, activated his intangibility at the last second, allowing the lightning to pass through him without causing harm. The electric blasts continued their course toward Diana, who was already prepared. Diana, with her bracelets ready, crossed her arms and deflected the energy of the lightning. The collision of electricity with the bracelets generated a shockwave, reverberating through the hall and creating a flash that illuminated the entire castle. Kaboom! Ares looked up at the exact moment his own energy, reflected by Diana's bracelets, returned toward him. The blinding flash filled Ares' entire field of vision, and he could see, in a moment frozen in time, the manifestation of his own fury coming back at him. The reflected lightning struck Ares directly in the chest, and the energy began to spread through his body, his veins pulsing with the destructive force of his own creation. The dark armor that enveloped Ares started to crack, each fissure spreading as if his essence were disintegrating from within. Ares screamed, a sound of pain and surprise that echoed through the castle ruins. The brightness in his eyes dimmed as he tried in vain to contain the force that was destroying him. His powerful form began to dissolve, fragments of energy escaping from his body like dust carried by the wind. Ares' expression, once arrogant and full of disdain, was now one of absolute terror. He was witnessing his own annihilation, powerless before the force he himself had unleashed. Diana observed the scene, her expression remaining resolute. She knew she couldn't let herself be shaken by the sight. Ares, responsible for so much destruction and suffering, was finally being defeated. Clark stood by her side, alert and prepared for any movement until the end. Ares, enveloped in an increasingly intense glow, became more and more translucent until his entire figure dissolved into pure light. The remaining energy exploded in a final shockwave that swept through the hall but caused no damage. Only silence remained as Ares' body completely disintegrated, leaving behind only emptiness. The distant sound of rhythmic marching echoed across the horizon as the English army approached the ruins of the castle. The metallic clinking of armor and weapons mixed with the steady steps of the soldiers advancing through the wreckage. Diana observed the troops approach, a brief smile appearing on her lips. "They're coming to congratulate us, Clark. For ending the war, for what we did here today," Diana said, her voice filled with hope and relief. Clark, however, wore a more serious expression. He knew the sight of the soldiers did not mean celebration, but an imminent threat. He looked at Diana, and without a word, picked her up in his arms, holding her firmly. "Clark, what are you doing?" Diana asked, surprised as she felt her body being lifted off the ground. "Why are we running? The war is over." Clark flew silently for a few moments, his eyes scanning the terrain below while the sound of the wind whistled around them. The desolate landscape faded behind them, and he knew he needed to explain to Diana what was really happening. He looked at her, his expression grave, deciding it was time to reveal the truth. "Diana, to them, it wasn't Ares who died today. They don't know what really happened. To the soldiers, the man who lived here was someone important to the army, someone they knew and respected." "But that doesn't make sense, Clark. Ares was here. He was responsible for this whole war." Diana protested, her eyes reflecting a mix of frustration and confusion. Clark nodded slightly, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "Ares may have ignited the spark for this war, Diana, but the fuel, the hatred, the ambition, the fear, was already here long before him. Ares fed off these emotions, yes, but human nature is full of these contradictions. Even without him, the war would have continued. I'm taking you to another place where you'll see for yourself that this conflict is far from over." Diana fell silent, still processing Clark's words. The idea that Ares was not the sole force responsible for the destruction they had witnessed was hard to accept. In her heart, she had always believed the god of war was the root of all this violence. And now, Clark was showing her a far more complex and challenging reality. Clark continued flying with Diana, cutting through the dark clouds as night fell. He knew the truths he was revealing were not easy to digest. Diana, always the brave warrior, needed to understand that not all battles could be won through physical strength and that some of the greatest struggles lay within the human heart itself. Diana decided to wait. She would wait until they arrived at the place Clark mentioned to draw her own conclusions. Still, something within her began to shift, to question the simplicity with which she had viewed the conflict. The words of her mother, Hippolyta, echoed in her mind. She clearly remembered her mother's grave tone as she warned her, "The world of men is a cruel place, Diana. They don't deserve you." The words had always seemed harsh, perhaps even unfair. But now, in light of what she had witnessed, she began to understand what her mother meant. The cruelty of men, their ability to destroy one another without hesitation, disturbed her deeply. Clark glanced at her, noticing the distant contemplative expression on her face. He knew Diana was in inner turmoil, struggling to reconcile what she believed to be true with the reality now unfolding before her. He held her a little tighter, offering silent support as they continued their journey into the unknown, seeking a deeper understanding of what it truly meant to fight for peace. German War Council. The members of the German High Command were gathered around a large oak table cluttered with maps, documents, and reports. The atmosphere was tense, their faces marked with exhaustion and frustration from a prolonged war. The silence was broken when one of the senior generals, General von Schiller, rose and began to speak. "Gentlemen, I believe we all agree that the war is unsustainable. We must consider an armistice. Continuing to fight at this rate is simply condemning more men to death and destroying what remains of our country." The officers around the table nodded, murmuring among themselves. Acceptance seemed to spread through the council like a breath of relief in the face of the devastation they had witnessed over the past months. The war had exacted a heavy toll, and the idea of peace was beginning to seem like the only logical and humane option. "We must accept that we cannot win," said General Muller, his voice laden with resignation. "It's better to negotiate now before it's too late." The murmurs grew louder in agreement, and consensus seemed imminent. However, the sound of the council doors abruptly opening interrupted the moment. General Ludendorff entered, his steps firm, his expression filled with disapproval. His gaze was fierce, and he wasted no time speaking. "You are all cowards." Ludendorff bellowed, his voice echoing through the hall, dripping with contempt. "You talk of armistice, of surrender? We cannot give up now. We must fight to the last man, to the last breath. Defeat is not an option." The hall fell silent for a moment, all eyes on Ludendorff. General von Schiller rose again, his face maintaining a controlled calm. "General Ludendorff, with all due respect, the war is already lost. We cannot sacrifice more lives for a cause that has proven impossible to win. The people are exhausted, and the army is no longer capable of fighting. We must be realistic. The war is over." Ludendorff glared at von Schiller, his eyes sparking with fury. "Realistic? You're willing to kneel before the enemy and accept humiliation? I will not stand for it. The war never ends as long as there is the will to fight." Another officer, Colonel Weiss, intervened, his voice firm but conciliatory. "General Ludendorff, we all know your dedication and courage, but we must think of the future of our country. Continuing this fight guarantees total destruction. We've lost enough. Now it's time to save what remains." Ludendorff scoffed, the disdain evident in his expression. He looked around the room, meeting the gaze of each council member as if daring someone to support him. But no one spoke. The silence was absolute, and Ludendorff realized he was alone in his obstinacy. "I see the war is over, especially for all of you," he muttered with contempt before abruptly turning and leaving the hall. Outside, Dr. Moreau waited anxiously. Her slender figure was draped in a dark overcoat, and her restless eyes were fixed on the council door. When the door burst open, Ludendorff emerged, his expression radiating contained rage. His eyes met Dr. Moreau's, and without a word, he made a subtle gesture with his hand. Dr. Moreau understood the message. With cold determination, she withdrew a small vial of gas from her pocket and moved toward the council door. In one swift motion, she tossed the vial inside, and before anyone could react, Ludendorff slammed the heavy doors shut with a metallic clang. Inside the hall, the general stared in shock at the vial spinning through the air before hitting the ground. Within seconds, the green gas began to spread, filling the room with a dense, toxic cloud. General von Schiller stepped back, his eyes wide as panic began to grip the council. "What is happening?" shouted one of the officers, coughing violently, his eyes watering from the noxious substance. General Muller fell to his knees, his hand pressed against his mouth and nose, but it was futile. The gas infiltrated every corner of the hall, making it increasingly difficult to breathe. Colonel Weiss attempted to reach one of the windows, but his movements were already sluggish, his muscles no longer obeying him. General von Schiller, struggling against the ever-thinning air, looked around, seeing his colleagues collapse one by one. The deadly silence that followed was broken only by desperate coughs and the muffled sounds of bodies hitting the floor. The gas filled the room until no one was left standing. The War Council was finished, sealed by the poison Ludendorff had chosen to eliminate any trace of opposition. The doors remained closed, and the deadly silence was the only evidence of the abrupt end of resistance. Ludendorff, seeing no further movement inside the hall, finally turned away. He cast a cold glance at Dr. Moreau and nodded. Now there are no more voices of weakness. Only those with the true will to fight remain.
And that concludes this episode. If you enjoyed it, I'd seriously love it if you guys could leave a like on the video, as it genuinely helps out so much, and it keeps me going, plus it takes only 1 second. That said, have a wonderful day. See you in the next one.